Driver Eddie Barmad hadn't returned home following his night shift. His wife was immediately anxious. Eddie was a devoted husband and he never deviated from routine. Her fears were well-founded.
The cabbie's final hours remain a mystery. He was last heard from at about 10 o'clock last night, taking a fare to Peakhurst, but was murdered in this secluded street on Sydney's northern beaches.
The scene was pretty much like any crime scene that you would go to, except the intensity of the attack on the victim was somewhat different to what you would see in other crime scenes, and the injuries that he had sustained were quite substantial and horrific.
Mr. Barmad emigrated from Lebanon in 1974. He leaves a wife and 7 children.
I was waiting this morning till my dad comes home. Yesterday I got 2 awards coming, first in maths and first in electronics. He wanted to see this, but now he's gone.
The victim in this particular case had sustained numerous wounds to the arms and the hands area, which is indicative of him trying to defend himself.
As police searched the surrounding area for the murder weapon, the first piece of hard evidence was found. The ignition key to the taxi was located in the gutter some 60 metres away from the murder scene.
The key tag for those keys had a person's fingerprint imprinted in the victim's blood.
The key tag was not the only potential lead.
We had blood smearing within the front passenger area of the cab and also in the rear of the cab behind the driver's seat. Those signs indicated to us that there were more than likely 2 people in the cab when this took place.
Swabs of those smears were taken for testing. Detectives hoped that during Mr. Barmad's desperate struggle, the killer or killers might have been injured. Traces of their blood might still remain in the cab.
He never harm anybody, all what he does believe, growing veggies. He doesn't have enemies, all people loves him.
On this particular occasion, the victim had a large wad of money in his top shirt pocket, and it became evident that robbery wasn't the motive. With the ferocity of the attack, you ask yourself, well, what then is the motive? It says to us as investigators, I really hate this person. It's an anger type attack. And there's another component that comes into that, and on this occasion it was a full moon. And I know even myself years ago I would poo-poo the theory, but you see so much evidence of it that people do act strangely at these times. And so not wanting to be single-minded about it, that was one of the considerations, that we had a deranged person running around out there. And the other aspect to that, which was quite intriguing, was the signs in the cab said we had 2 people. Do you then have 2 deranged people running around? And that was a major interest to us.
A month later, another grisly murder. This time a torso had been discovered, washed up on the shores of a secluded bay.
The torso was found just a metre from the shore. It was first noticed on Tuesday.
It was all wrapped up in bubble wrap and string bag, and I didn't take much notice of it really, just thought it looked odd.
I went over and photographed the torso in situ. I turned the body over and saw that there was a further package containing rocks which had been wired together on the back of the torso.
Looking at the torso, it appeared quite clear that it was the torso of a male in the prime of his life. He was solid, he was very, very tall. Thinking about that and thinking about people missing in the area that fitted that description, my mind went back to Stephen Dempsey, who disappeared some 3.5 months earlier, but very, very much fitted that physical description.
Say hi to Steve. Hi, Steve. Hi, Steve.
Stephen Dempsey was a 34-year-old landscape gardener who hadn't been seen since leaving work on August the 2nd, 1994.
Mr. Dempsey, look at his sexy body.
His abandoned car was found at a well-known homosexual beat 3 days later by his business partner, Peter Rolfe.
On my way home, I was going down the Wakehurst Parkway, and as I just drove past the entrance to Deep Creek, I suddenly remembered that Stephen told me that he used to frequent the place there. So I drove in and there was his car parked there. I raced out of my car, looked at his car, and I saw the book he'd been reading the last time I saw him, lying page down on the passenger seat, and also his camera was lying there, and that suggested to me that perhaps he was still around the place.
There was also a food container lying on the floor of the car. The label read August 2nd, the last time friends or family had seen Stephen alive.
The adrenaline was pumping, of course, when I found his car, but at the same time there was this terrible fear as to what on earth had happened, because it was so totally unlike him. Okay, perhaps there was some reason he wouldn't contact me, but the fact that he wouldn't contact his sister, who he lived with, to explain his disappearance for 3 days. I yelled out his name a few times, and I was panicking, in a state of shock, and that's when I thought, right, I've got to notify the police straight away.
Police fear for the safety of a man missing from Sydney's northern beaches since Tuesday.
Mr Dempsey was last seen here in Neutral Bay working as a landscaper, but late yesterday his car was found at Deep Creek Reserve near Narrabeen.
It was locked up and intact. There was no visible signs of any foul play there. We would be seeking the assistance of people who frequent the reserve at Narrabeen. A lot of people would have been there and seen this motor vehicle over the last couple of days.
Someone had. Deep Creek Reserve was also a dog training area. For 3 mornings in a row, one dog owner noticed Stephen Dempsey's car parked in the same spot. On one of those mornings, his dogs pulled a boot from the creek.
We'd never found him at all except for a boot and a pair of sunglasses.
Both items were identified by the family as belonging to Stephen Dempsey. What detectives were yet to know was that this murder, now seemingly unrelated, would be linked to that of the taxi driver. When a torso was found washed up on a shore, one of the first things was to establish its identity. Without that, there was little chance that detectives could figure out a motive or find the killer. The remains were taken to the morgue in hope that the forensic pathologist could find some answers.
We often x-ray the decomposed body to see if we can find any signs of any projectiles, any sort of unusual findings, any fractures and so forth. So in this case, the body was x-rayed before we did anything else. And then when we x-rayed it, we saw an object in the middle of the chest, which looked like to me was a large scalpel blade. When we opened the chest and saw the blood and saw the arrow, we all said, oh my goodness.
Detective Lynch already suspected that the torso was that of Stephen Dempsey, and the discovery of the arrowhead in the heart narrowed the odds. 4 months earlier, the detective had sent divers into this creek, and what they found was now potentially a vital piece of evidence.
A bow and arrow had been found in the vicinity at the bottom of Deep Creek a short time after Mr Dempsey disappeared. Now that bow had been very corroded when we first discovered it, which led everyone to believe it had been there for in fact a lot longer than it had. Attached to that was a quiver with about 3 arrows with broadheads, and the broadhead was identical to the one that was in the chest of the deceased. I was fairly sure then my hunch had something to it.
I sort of said, well, that's fine, but this man's is too well preserved to have been dead for as long as this person had been. He didn't appear to me to be dead for 4 months.
Chris Lawrence was saying the body had been in the water for 3 weeks, so he had 3 months and a week to account for where had Stephen Dempsey been during that time. That was the mystery.
Well, I said, if it is him, then he's been somewhere else. They've put him somewhere in cold storage or done something with the body in the meantime.
There seemed little doubt that the torso was that of Stephen Dempsey, but it needed to be confirmed.
And in this particular case, all we had was a torso, and the only thing that was going to identify that person for us was his DNA.
But in order to do that, you have to have both the mother and the father. In this case, we did. There was blood still in the chest cavity, and so we did have usable nuclear DNA from the torso, and we were able to get a pretty quick result.
DNA tests have solved a murder mystery which has baffled Sydney police for months. They've confirmed that a human torso found at Pittwater last month was the remains of a man missing since August.
For the family of Stephen Dempsey, it's a tragic end to a 4-month search.
We know that Mr Dempsey died as a result of a penetrating injury to the chest area.
But that's virtually all police know, and they're again appealing to the public for help.
While the identity of the torso made headlines, the cause of death remained a secret.
With any investigation, you are very, very mindful about the evidence that you've got, firstly, and the information that you do and do not release. On this particular occasion, it occurred to us that the offender had overlooked the fact that he had left the arrowhead embedded in the victim's heart. And that arrowhead was the sole piece of evidence at that time that we had which connected the deceased to the killer.
But that arrowhead wasn't the only thing the killer had left behind. The forensic pathologist had also found possible clues to the killer's identity.
I've seen a number of bodies that had been dismembered, and this one had been done incredibly neatly. It appeared to be someone who knew what they were doing. Someone like a boner, somebody who worked in an abattoir, possibly even someone with medical skill.
And when Detective Lynch took the bow from Deep Creek to an archery specialist, he got more leads on the killer.
It had been built specifically to be very, very powerful, that bow. It had been put together to be powerful. And that was determined ultimately by what they call the draw weight, the amount of strength it takes to draw the string back. Well, this suggested that the person had it was fairly solid, he was fairly strong. Second of all, you could make a measurement between the bow handle and where the string's position was when it was fully strung. And that would give you the length between a person's wrist and their shoulder. And looking at that, it was worked out that the person that had a bow like that would have been about 5 foot 9 inches tall, 5 foot 10 inches tall.
Then another piece was added to the puzzle. A young man reported an incident at Deep Creek in December 93, some 8 months before Stephen Dempsey disappeared.
It was dusk. He and his friend had been walking along the path one way and they saw someone walking the opposite way. As they walked past him, they saw he was carrying a compound bow. They've heard a noise, they've turned around to see this person with the compound bow cocked and pointing at them. One of them scattered into the bush and ran away. The other one went into the bush, picked up a big stick and confronted this guy. Now luckily, that person had been a member of the Field Archery Club nearby and he had a very, very good knowledge of bows and arrowheads, etc., etc. He identified the bow as being a camouflaged compound bow, which was identical to the bow that we'd recovered in the water. He then described the arrowhead that he'd seen on that bow and which had been pointing at him, and he'd seen it fairly clearly as being a Davies Aztec arrowhead. He then went on to give a fairly accurate description of the person that had propped him with the bow. He was a male. He was 5 foot 9. He was a fairly solid build. He was white Australian. He was wearing a motorcycle jacket, which was interesting. And he was 8 months prior to the murder seen with the bow, with identical arrowheads, some 100 yards away from the murder scene.
So was this person the killer of Stephen Dempsey? And what, if any, was his connection with the brutal murder of taxi driver Eddie Barmad? Nearly 4 months after the investigation began into Stephen Dempsey's murder, the police hit a brick wall.
With the detailed profile that we had, we knew a lot about the man. We didn't have his name. By releasing the cause of death with the arrowhead as being the cause, we were straight away narrowing down the field of people we would be possibly looking for.
Police are hunting a Sydney Rambo who murdered a young gardener with an arrow through the heart.
32-year-old Mr Dempsey was targeted at Deep Creek Reserve, Narrabeen, a notorious gay pickup beat. Police now fear the killer could be living out a sick fantasy, stalking bushwalkers on Sydney's northern beaches. 2 others had previously been menaced the year before Mr Dempsey's murder.
We're appealing to the public if they could come forward with any information, especially if they frequent the area down there, any information they have of seeing a man carrying a bow and arrow with quiver in the vicinity of the park from November 1993 through to about August 1994.
We released information and almost straight away we started getting calls from members of the public.
Good morning, Mandeville Police. Can I help you?
I'm a member of a bushwalking group and I do recall being in Deep Creek Reserve about 18 months ago. We saw a young guy and he had a bow and an arrow and I remember he said, "Watch out, there are a couple of poofters down the track."
He was hunting for fish with a bow and arrow. It was one of those fancy-looking bows with the pulleys on either end.
Is there any more information you can give us about this gentleman?
I'd say he'd be in his early 20s. He's about, say, 5'9", 5'10".
I was in the Deep Creek area on the northern beaches paddling a kayak, and something very strange up there happened. There was a guy up there, and I thought at the time that he was just fishing with a bow and arrow.
Was there any warning prior to that?
No, he didn't say anything. He continued to follow me. He was going through the bush at quite a rate of knots, so I was paddling as hard as I could, but he seemed intent on keeping up with me.
So there was certainly a person around that had a fetish with bows and arrows and assaulting people with them, or certainly scaring them.
He threatened 2 young guys. When was this?
Out of the hundreds of calls police received, 5 mentioned one person. 22-year-old Richard Leonard.
Who lived nearby. He was the same build, he was the same age group. He had a camouflaged compound bow in his house. Well, I certainly had one at this time. He rode a motorcycle. He'd worked in an abattoir, and from every person we'd spoken to, he displayed the idiosyncrasies that we thought we were looking for with our man. We were cooking with gas, so to speak.
It now seemed as though the police had found their killer. But when they entered Richard Leonard's name into their computer to check on any previous form or convictions, their investigation took a whole new turn.
He presented at St Vincent's Hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning with his girlfriend, suffering from a knife wound to the chest. It had actually punctured his lung, deflated his lung.
He needed to have a drain put into his chest, into his lungs, and it's a very painful process apparently. And he refused painkillers and wanted to revel in the experience, so we were told. And again, this all adds to the picture of the person we're looking at as being somewhat different to your normal and quite strange.
He said initially to the police that spoke to him at the hospital that he'd been attacked by a group of people in Hyde Park. Then he changed his story and in fact said that the injury was a result of an S&M session he'd had with his girlfriend. She too had some injuries to her hands at the time. But the police obviously hadn't believed him. They were a little bit perplexed about it. They couldn't take it any further with what they had. So they'd just put the report on that they'd spoken to this person at the St Vincent's Hospital.
The date Richard Leonard was admitted to St Vincent's was the 18th of November 1994, the same day as Eddie Barmad, the taxi driver, was found dead in his cab.
When our crime scene team examined Mr Barmad's taxi at Colorado Plateau, an unusual looking smear was seen in the centre of the steering wheel. It actually was a different colour to surrounding blood smears, and that's why it caught the eye of our examiner, Richard Layton, who took a swab of that blood for analysis, and it was found to be a mixture of 2 persons' DNA, one being Mr Barmad, but that was only the minor component. The major component was from an unknown person. It appeared that the offender may have been cut and injured himself during the struggle.
For us, it was starting to get pretty exciting by this stage, because there we have 2 people, both wounded on the night that the cab drivers murdered, and 2 separate inquiries started to come together. And it was at that time that we thought that we had a psychopathic killer on our hands.
22-year-old Richard Leonard was a person of interest in the death of Stephen Dempsey, but that interest intensified when police discovered that he and his 19-year-old girlfriend had been injured on the same night that taxi driver Eddie Barmad was murdered.
We commenced surveillance on him, kept tabs on him, what he was doing, and we went as far as we could to check the background information that we'd received about him. And everyone that we spoke to that knew the man confirmed the behavioural patterns about him that we suspected he'd be showing. He seemed like a disturbed man.
As a result of that, we developed an investigative strategy which required us to eventually confront them and to interview them.
When we spoke to him in the house and introduced ourselves and conducted a search warrant there and told him that we suspected him for 2 murders, He was as cool as cool. We could have been door-to-door salesmen. We could have been a friend calling over. There was no appreciable fear, no concern, no outrage. That sort of suggestion would be put to him. I remember he sat down when he agreed to come to us to Manly Police Station. I think very, very calmly laced about a 32 lace Doc Marten boot. Put both of them on. Took all the time in the world. Very, 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 very cool.
And do you agree that I told you that we were making inquiries in relation to the death of a man by the name of Stephen Dempsey?
Yes, that is correct.
Do you agree you told me you did not wish to say anything in terms of that matter?
Yes, that is correct.
Do you agree in other conversations we've had, you told me that you once had a bow and arrow when you were living at Excelsior Street, Coleroy Plateau?
Yes, that is correct.
Do you also agree you told me that the arrowheads you used were arrowheads called bodkins?
Bodkin.
Bodkins.
Bodkin, they are a tin alloy head comprising of 3 blades.
Right.
Like a tripod.
Okay, fine. Have you ever used broadheads?
No.
At all?
It was a key statement. Leonard was denying that he ever used broadhead arrows. It was a broadhead that was found in Stephen Dempsey's heart, and it was a broadhead that the 2 young men had identified when they were threatened at Deep Creek Reserve.
That obviously caused us to continue our inquiries, and as a result of previous information we'd received, we identified premises that he used to rent, and we canvassed the local neighbours who told us that he used to sit on the back porch and shoot arrows into an apple tree in the backyard. As a result of that, we examined that tree, and lo and behold, we find embedded underneath the bark, we stripped the bark off, and embedded underneath the bark we find arrowheads identical to the type that we located from the deceased.
Do you also agree that today you have provided us with samples of your hair and a blood sample?
Yes, that is correct. Our purpose behind that was obviously to compare it with the blood sample we'd found at the murder of Mr. Barmads.
Do I have to find my own way home, or can I get a
Yeah, the time is now 3:18 p.m. One further, just one final thing. Richard, do you agree with that jacket was at your house today?
Yes, I do.
Jacket. Oh, that's your jacket?
Yes. He went home. We were in a position to know he spoke to his girlfriend straight away, and he left the house never to return.
We knew at that stage that we were on the right track, but there was no point in arresting this person and charging him without the evidence.
And that evidence was Leonard's blood sample, sent for DNA analysis.
The first test indicated to them that, yes, there was a likelihood that his blood sample specimen matched the one taken from the cab, but they had to go through further processes, and that would take a few more days. As you can imagine, we're extremely anxious at this stage. We're concerned that it will match, obviously, because if it doesn't match, we've just hit a brick wall and we have to go back to scratch.
The second test was positive, and then we reached the point where the night before the third test was due back, Richard Leonard called us up, said that he was the Christian City Church at Sydenham Road, Brookvale, and he wanted to speak to us, and he was with his girlfriend.
Leonard had made admissions to the pastor about his involvement in these crimes and wanted to give himself up to police.
They were each clutching a Bible, and he told me he'd shaved his head during the night as some cleansing process relative to, confessing all sins.
Police swooped on a church at Brookvale last night, arresting 19-year-old Denise Shipley and her 22-year-old boyfriend Richard Leonard.
On speaking to a pastor, he then made a phone call to the local authorities, and from there a arresting officer came down to the church.
Under heavy security, the couple was accused of killing cabbie Ezzedine Barmad. Leonard also charged with the murder of gardener Stephen Dempsey.
But while Richard Leonard admitted to murdering the taxi driver, he claimed that he killed Stephen Dempsey in self-defence.
I wanted him to be stopped
I didn't want him to come any closer to me. I felt threatened.
It was now up to the detectives and forensic specialists to prove him wrong.
All right. Do you agree, Mr. Leonard, I spoke to you last night, about the death of Mr. Dempsey?
Yes.
And do you agree you told me that indeed you were responsible for Mr. Dempsey's death by firing an arrow into his chest?
Yes, I believe I was responsible.
Right. And do you agree in the interview last night you told me that when you arrived you put your bow in a cave while you went further up the creek to see if there were any fish in the creek?
Yes.
That's correct?
That's right.
Mr. Leonard told us that whilst high on speed, he'd gone down to the deep creek with his compound bow, which he used to shoot fish in the creek. He'd left it in a cave, scattered along the creek to see if there were any mullet to shoot, came back and said he was then propositioned by Stephen Dempsey, who was in the cave and urinating at the time.
You've gone into the cave there, you've seen Mr. Dempsey urinating, he smiled at you, you've come outside. What did you do then?
He stood over here and he said, "You're going to suck the guy's dick." And I said, "No," I picked up my bow and I pointed at him and I said, don't come over here, I'm going to shoot him." And he said, "I don't believe you." And then he said, "I'm going to walk towards you now." And he walked, he started coming towards me. And at about 10 feet, I let go of the string and the arrow went into him.
Was it your intention to kill Mr. Dempsey when you fired the arrow at him?
It wasn't my intention to kill anybody when I fired the arrow at him. I wanted him to be stopped. I didn't want him to come any closer to me. I felt threatened.
But the detectives did not believe his version of events. They believed Richard Leonard deliberately and callously killed Stephen Dempsey.
Everything we knew about a compound bow at that time suggested they were very, very powerful weapons, and most of the people that had shot them were of the opinion that a compound bow fired in such a way would have virtually gone straight through a person. In the case of Mr. Dempsey, that hadn't happened. The arrow had lodged fairly firmly in his heart, maybe halfway through the body. And that didn't correspond with the range and the power of the bow that Mr. Leonard had and the way he described it had occurred.
In an attempt to rebut Leonard's version of events, the team decided to reenact the scene using a pig carcass.
We obtained an identical bow, identical arrowheads, and we conducted a series of tests from varying distances.
Leonard had said he shot Mr. Dempsey from 10 feet, or 3 metres away. At that distance, the arrow went straight through the carcass.
The arrow that corresponded with the type of wound that Mr. Dempsey suffered was fired from a range of about 9 or 10 metres from memory, which was more than twice the distance that Richard Leonard was telling us he'd fired the arrow at. It suggested that what he was telling us wasn't right. It didn't make sense given the bow that he had.
And we were always of the belief that it resembled the stalking and hunting of a human being rather than a game animal. He used to go down there to hunt with his bow and shoot fish, and it sort of was a progression, if you like, from just hunting mere fish to stalking a human game and actually shooting him from a distance. Now, these tests, they were certainly not to the point scientifically that would be accepted as being irrefutable in court as evidence, but it was something that we had to do for ourselves.
The pig test wasn't allowed in court, but the jury did get to hear a taped conversation that showed Leonard wasn't threatened by Dempsey's homosexuality, as he had claimed.
In his interview, he was building a defence of provocation, which suggests that he'd been outraged by a homosexual advance made to him. But we'd had a recorded telephone call from Mr. Leonard where he was attempting to get a job in a male brothel.
Yes, hello, my name is Richard. I'm just wondering if you have any positions vacant at the moment.
Yeah, we're always looking for people. Do you realise it's male to male, most of our work?
I do realise, yes.
What do you look like?
Okay, I'm around about 5'10", athletic build.
Right.
Around about a 6-inch cock. What else could I tell you?
Are you smooth or hairy?
Smooth.
Smooth, right. And how old are you?
22.
22. When can you come in for an interview?
So we knew that the perceived outrage or
fainted outrage didn't really have very much substance. Again, that put another hole in his in the story he was giving us.
Another tape presented to court was even more damning.
Some months after we charged Mr. Leonard, police conducting another inquiry were able to provide us with a tape from the jail in which Mr. Leonard just callously was bragging about the circumstances of killing Stephen Dempsey.
It was funny, he copped the fucking arrow and went straight in his fucking heart. Anyway, it was really funny. You should have seen his face, right? There he is. He's just fucking, he's there, and all of a sudden he just goes, he starts making this like a death noise sort of thing. You can't fucking believe what's happening. It's real funny, He just he's completely spun out. It's like, oh fuck, I can't believe it's come to this.
The account given in that tape certainly indicated a state of mind that was far more calculating, far more callous than the shocked, affronted, almost apologetic account that he gave in his record of interview at Manly.
And I realised that this guy's dead. And so I spent out and I grabbed the guy's legs and I pulled him over to Deep Creek. And then he sank down into the water, and then I picked up my bow and ran a few steps to get momentum, and I threw it into the water.
And then of all things, he went to his mother's birthday party. After the party, he came back to Deep Creek with his trident boning knife. And in the middle of the night, he sat in Deep Creek and dismembered Mr. Dempsey's remains.
I took out the knife, and it was very bright. I think I remember the moon. It wasn't full. It was pretty close to it. But it was a bright night, and I took the knife and I cut into the leg, and I cut around the leg, and then I cut up into the joint. I used to work in an abattoir.
Yeah.
So I don't think unless I'd worked in this place, and I don't think I would have been able to do what I did.
He then put the limbs and the head in one bag and the torso in the other, and then did 2 separate trips on his motorcycle and took them back to where he was living. And he put the remains in his refrigerator where they were to stay for the next 3.5 months.
I just took everything out of the fridge and put everything in there, including his clothes.
On August the 2nd, 1994, Richard Leonard shot Stephen Dempsey with a bow and arrow. He then dismembered the body and put the remains in his fridge. 2 weeks later, the killer began a relationship with 18-year-old Denise Shipley.
I said, there is a person in the fridge. And she was quite shocked.
The two had known each other some years before when they attended the same church group. 4 years later, they discovered a mutual love of drugs and violence. And on the 17th of November 1994, that combination proved lethal.
The two went into the city, allegedly then under the influences of LSD. They've wandered around the city.
And we eventually found ourselves in Hyde Park, and then we decided we'd go home again. I only had enough money to catch a bus back, but Denise really wanted to get the taxi, so I said, okay, well, we'll get the taxi, but you realise it means we're going to have to get out and run away. So he got into this cab, and the driver was, what's his name?
The driver's name was Mr. Ezzedine Barmad.
Ezzedine Barmad.
Yes.
So the driver was Ezzedine Barmad. He said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, we want to go to Colorado Plateau."
He's then told us that he's didn't have the money to pay the fare, so he's pulled a knife out and put it to Mr. Barmad's throat. The way he describes it as just being, well, he didn't know what else to do.
I pulled out my knife from the inside pocket of my Nike jacket and put the point of the knife to the driver's neck. And said, "Don't move." At the time I said, "Don't move," he grabbed the knife out of my hand. And then everything got completely insane.
Mr. Barmad's grabbed the knife from him, they've struggled, and he's been able to stab him once to the chest.
And I got stabbed in the chest through my jacket.
By Mr. Barmad.
By Mr. Barmad.
Richard Leonard, who was a fairly strong bloke, has been able to grab the knife and has just, in a frenzy, attacked Mr. Barmad.
And I was wildly stabbing as I was trying to get into the front on top of him, and was stabbing everywhere.
What hand did you have the knife?
Would have been my right hand, and my knife was very sharp. So I had a steel that I used, and I always had my knife sharp. It was my favourite knife. Mm-hmm. And it actually cost me $90, that knife. And so you could get a tomato and slice it like a razor blade. It was really good.
At some stage during the struggle, Leonard left his calling card on the steering wheel. His fingerprints were confirmed as being the ones investigators found on the ignition key.
After receiving treatment at St Vincent's Hospital, Leonard and Shipley have returned home and realised that there could be some activity relative to the police, and they've then decided to discard Mr Dempsey's remains. They've driven to Church Point, where we found the receipt where they hired the boat from the boat shed, little runabout, little tinny.
So did they come down here in the boat?
Yes.
She crashed in the sandbag somewhere around here, you indicated. What did you do then?
I got her to go for a walk, and I carried two parcels in sheets down and put them into the boat with wire ties and a pair of pliers.
And what were those two parcels you were referring to?
They were the remains of Mr Dempsey.
Leonard's pulled some rocks from the shore, put those in the boat, and as he's made his way into Pittwater, he's wired the rocks to the torso.
There's only one thing I know I can absolutely say as a fact, and that was that there was no residential dwellings in the place where I stopped, and I drifted. So, to my mind, logic, I would say that I stopped here.
He's thrown the remains over the side of the boat and then returned the boat, cleaned the boat out, and they've gone home.
3 weeks later, the torso surfaced and Leonard's perfect crime came undone.
Without that arrowhead, there's a very good possibility, without an admission of guilt from somebody, that we never ever would have solved it, because it was the one piece of evidence that led us to the offender.
Richard Leonard's trial for the murder of Stephen Dempsey lasted 12 days.
The court was told how, as a child, Leonard had spent his school holidays with his grandmother, chopping off the ears and tails of little kittens. And when he ran out of kittens to mutilate, his grandmother would just buy him more.
It's always nail-biting, waiting for a jury to return. In this case, the jury was out for 4 days. The team were on edge. But more than anything, I think we really felt for the family of the two victims on this occasion. It was very, very tough for them.
The judge described Richard William Leonard as the epitome of evil.
Richard Leonard is only 24 years old, but a judge has decided he must spend the rest of his life in prison for killing New Zealander Stephen Dempsey and taxi driver Esdean Barmad.
We're very happy.
Very happy.
Yeah, thank you.
Family friends of the taxi driver, stabbed 37 times by Leonard 3 years ago, say the life imprisonment is deserved.
I love to see him, suffer, like us, like the children he left behind.
In sentencing Leonard, Justice Badgery Parker said imposing life imprisonment was a very serious step, but the fact that Richard Leonard had killed 2 people and been diagnosed as a psychopath meant he'd always be a risk to the community.
His girlfriend, Denise Shipley, was sentenced to a minimum of 3 years and a maximum of 8 for her involvement as an accessory after the fact to both murders.
The result when it came through, well, they were elated. It was a huge release of a burden for them, and certainly the never-to-be-released sentence. That was everything they could have hoped for. We were never going to bring their son or father back, but as the team we were able to give them everything we certainly could in terms of the way we went round our job.
California. 20 years after a girl vanished into the dark, a headline flashes across local screens like a verdict. California, 20-year-old disappearance resolved. Police announce breakthrough. On paper, it sounds final, clean. A neat line under 2 lost decades. But behind that bold font and the confident tone of the press conference, there is a town that never really slept again, a family that never stopped listening for footsteps on the porch, and a case that, even now, refuses to sit quietly in the past. This is the story of a girl who walked out of the light and never came home. A girl whose first name became a warning, a whisper, a campfire legend told to teenagers who parked on lonely roads after midnight. Her photograph faded behind the glass of the post office bulletin board, but her eyes never stopped following people through the years. Her name was Lily Hart, 19 years old, college freshman home for summer break. Last seen on a warm June night in 2005 in a small coastal community in Northern California that liked to call itself the safest town on the bay. Back then, Harbor Point was the kind of postcard place where nothing truly bad was supposed to happen. Tourists wandered the boardwalk. The sheriff's office was small, the crime blotter thinner than the high school newsletter, and the worst thing anyone could remember was a bar fight that ended in a broken nose and a lifetime ban from Rudy's Tavern. Harbor Point sold safety as an identity, and the residents bought it completely. Which is why, on that night in June, when a neighbor heard a scream out on the wind and decided it must have been teenagers goofing around near the cliffs, they turned up the volume on the TV and thought nothing more of it. The air smelled like the ocean and grilled burgers drifting from backyard cookouts. It was summer, it was harmless, it was California. Until, very quietly, it wasn't. Lily had spent the afternoon with friends on the beach, the kind of day that looks ordinary in photos until you know it's the last one. In every image recovered from those hours, she's laughing, dark hair whipped by the wind, footprints leaving temporary scars on the wet sand. They built a driftwood fire as the sun slipped under the horizon. Someone opened a cheap bottle of champagne to celebrate the end of finals. Someone else suggested a late-night drive along Ridgeview Road, the narrow, twisting two-lane that ran past the cliffs and into the forest, the place parents always said to avoid after dark. Lily said she'd catch up later. She had promised her mom she'd be home by 11. One friend remembers her standing by the lifeguard tower, waving them off with her car keys in hand. Another swears she walked with them to the parking lot and then peeled off toward the boardwalk. The stories would never quite match, not even in official statements. Tiny details shifted with each retelling, like the tide creeping in, erasing the same line of footprints over and over. Somewhere in that moving sand, the truth was buried. What is not disputed is this. At 10:47 p.m., Lily texted her mother, just 4 words. On my way home. No emojis, no extra punctuation, no trace of fear. The cell tower ping placed her phone somewhere near the intersection of Harbor Drive and Ridgeview Road. After that, the signal moved once more, half a mile closer to the cliffs, then went silent. No more texts, no outgoing calls, no social media posts. The digital trail of a 19-year-old girl went dead in under 10 minutes. At 11:30 p.m., with Lily's bed still empty and the house still quiet, her mother, Diane, called her phone twice. Both times it rang through to voicemail, that chirpy recording. Hey, it's Lily, leave a message. At 11:45, she drove the familiar route herself, headlights slicing through the dark, scanning the side of the road for a broken-down car, a flat tire, anything. The asphalt was empty. The night felt heavier than it should have. By midnight, she was at the sheriff's office front desk, hands shaking, voice low but firm. "My daughter is missing." At first, the response followed the script small towns always tell themselves. She's probably with friends. She's probably lost track of time. 19-year-olds don't just vanish between the Walmart parking lot and the turnoff for the cliffs. The deputy on duty tried to sound reassuring. "We'll keep an eye out, ma'am. Give it a few hours." But Diane had already looked into her daughter's room. The bed was made. Her favorite hoodie was still hanging from the back of the chair. The frame map of the world above her desk still had tiny pins marking all the places she planned to go. No overnight bag was missing, no jacket, no escape plan. By 2 a.m., the patrol cars were out on the road, sweeping the usual routes. Ridgeview Road, Harbor Drive, the access point to the cliffs. Their spotlights crawled over trees and guardrails, cutting across the same curve in the asphalt where kids used to brag about taking the turn at 50 miles an hour. An officer found a broken headlight shard near mile marker 9, but wrote it off as old, dulled by dust and rain. No skid marks, no fresh scrape in the asphalt, no sign of Lily's little blue Corolla. By sunrise, Harbor Point was no longer the safest town on the bay. Flashing red and blue lit up the early morning mist as more units arrived. Yellow tape appeared along the cliffside turnout. Search and rescue volunteers gathered at the community center, coffee in hand, maps spread across folding tables. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man everyone simply called Rick, stepped up to a makeshift podium and tried to sound in control. "We have a missing person. We are treating this as a priority." The word priority landed like a stone in the room. No one wanted to say abduction. No one wanted to say body. That first day blurred into something surreal. Helicopters traced slow circles above the coastline. Dogs followed scent trails that suddenly stopped at patches of dirt or dead grass. Volunteers combed the ditches with sticks, each person quietly praying not to find what they were looking for. Pieces of clothing were bagged and tagged, only to be dismissed later as unrelated. Harbor Point, for the first time, felt like a crime scene. By the second night, the media vans had rolled in. Satellite dishes unfolded in the parking lot outside the sheriff's office. Bright lights snapped on as reporters went live for the 10 o'clock broadcast. "A Northern California community is on edge tonight after 19-year-old college student Lily Hart vanished without a trace." Neighbors watched from their living rooms, seeing their quiet streets splashed across the screen like a movie they hadn't agreed to be in. Diane and her husband Mark stood at their first press conference, clutching a printed photo the police had asked them to bring, Lily smiling at the camera, sunlight in her hair, the bay behind her. Diane's voice cracked only once as she pleaded for information. "If you know anything, anything at all, please come forward. Lily, if you can hear this, we love you, just come home." Behind the cameras, officers scanned the crowd, watching faces, looking for any flinch, any sign of someone who knew more than they were saying. But the days kept passing, and Harbor Point began to split into two versions of itself. In one, life tried to go on. Children still rode their bikes to school. Tourists still bought souvenir t-shirts and ice cream cones. In the other, a darker overlay. Every empty lot became a potential dump site. Every stranger a suspect. Every unlit corner a threat. Parents changed curfews overnight. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades now clicked shut at dusk. The first week ended with no arrest, no vehicle, no confirmed sightings, just a widening circle of fear and unanswered questions. Harbor Point went from safest town on the bay to a name in a scrolling banner at the bottom of national news broadcasts. Flyers with Lily's face went up on telephone poles, supermarket doors, the windows of out-of-business shops on Main Street. Rain stained the ink, the paper curling at the edges, but no one took them down. Taking them down would have felt like admitting something no one was ready to say. Years from now, when the headline finally screamed California 20-year-old disappearance resolved, officials would talk about the early days of the search as if they had always been moving toward that ending, as if every misstep was just part of a path leading to eventual answers. But in June 2005, standing under buzzing fluorescent lights in the sheriff's cramped briefing room, staring at a map dotted with red pushpins and highlighted routes, there was nothing inevitable, nothing certain, nothing resolved. There was only a missing girl, a grieving family, and a town that had just been jolted awake into a new reality where monsters were no longer confined to urban legends and late-night movies. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of floodlights and search grids, past the cliffside guardrail and the tree line and the comforting hum of the highway, the secret of what happened to Lily Hart on that warm June night waited in the dark, untouched, unspoken, and absolutely unwilling to stay buried forever. By the third day, the missing posters had become part of the landscape. They fluttered on telephone poles, store windows, the glass door of Rudy's Tavern, rows of Lily's face staring out over Harbor Point like a chorus of silent questions. 19. Brown hair, 5'5", last seen in a white tank top and cut-off jeans. Last seen near the boardwalk. Last seen driving a blue Toyota Corolla. Last seen, then nothing. Inside the sheriff's office, the story was less poetic and far more brutal. Maps taped to the walls, circles inked in red around Ridgeview Road, highlighters slashed across possible routes home, a whiteboard crowded with names, times, phone numbers, fragments of statements. Friend group, beach. Last verified sighting, Lifeguard Tower, 10:20 p.m. Text to mom, 10:47. Tower ping, Ridgeview intersection. Signal lost. Each line looked simple, but behind it were hours of interviews, contradictions, and the growing suspicion that someone was lying. The first circle of scrutiny was always the same: friends, family, boyfriend. Detectives moved through Lily's world like quiet storms, knocking on doors, stepping into living rooms still warm with her presence. Posters on her bedroom wall, half-written notes in her handwriting, textbooks on her desk with sticky notes in the margins. They opened drawers, checked closets, photographed her computer, her journal, the contents of her backpack. They were looking for a fight, a secret, a plan to run. They found none. Her friends repeated the same rough outline: beach day, bonfire, sunset, drinks. The details wobbled. One said they saw Lily leave the sand around 10, hugging people goodbye, keys jingling in her hand, saying something about her mom killing her if she was late. Another insisted she stayed until after 10:30, that she heard Lily joking about maybe driving up Ridgeview for the view. One remembered a dark SUV parked near the boardwalk that hadn't been there earlier. Another swore there was a silver pickup that kept looping past the lot. Memory under stress becomes a funhouse mirror. The detectives zeroed in on one name: Jason Cole, 20 years old, local boy, off and on boyfriend, the kind of kid teachers described as smart but restless. He'd been at the beach earlier in the day but left before the bonfire, clocking in for his shift at the gas station off Highway 12. Security footage confirmed he was behind the counter until midnight, bored, scrolling his phone, occasionally glancing up as customers came and went. When detectives pulled the footage, they watched his face frame by frame, looking for panic, guilt, some flicker of knowledge. They found only the flat stare of a young man who didn't yet realize his whole life had just gone off a cliff. Still, they brought him in, sat him under harsh fluorescent lights, asked him where they had been the last time he'd seen her, if they'd fought. He admitted they'd argued 2 nights before about her plans to transfer to a bigger university down south. She wanted out, he said, voice shaky. Out of here, out of Harbor Point. I was being an ass about it. He kept repeating the same phrase. She wouldn't just leave. Not like this, not without her mom. The detectives nodded, wrote it all down, then circled his name in a slightly darker line of ink. Then came the witnesses who saw too much, or not enough. A fisherman who claimed he'd seen a small car pulled over near mile marker 8 on Ridgeview around 11, hazard lights blinking. Asked if he was sure of the time, he wasn't. Asked if he got a look at the driver, he didn't. A couple who drove the same road around midnight, arguing loudly with the radio up, who later remembered, maybe, seeing a blue car parked near the overlook. Could it have been Lily's? Maybe. Could it have been there earlier? Maybe. Every answer dissolved under pressure. Forensic teams combed Ridgeview Road inch by inch. They scraped paint from guardrails, photographed skid marks, measured fresh dents, tested soil near the drop-offs for signs of impact. The cliffs there were deceptive, not sheer walls but jagged, layered slopes of rock and brush, steep enough to be deadly, cluttered enough to hide a car from anyone who wasn't looking from exactly the right angle. Helicopters scanned the coastline with infrared cameras. Dive teams checked the waters below for twisted metal. Day after day, searchers returned with sunburns, sore muscles, and nothing to show for it but the persistent ache of failure. Then, on day 6, a deputy found something in a drainage ditch off a narrow spur road that branched from Ridgeview, a single white sneaker stained with mud, laces trailing, lying half buried in weeds. The brand and size matched a pair Lily's parents said she owned. Photos were taken. The area was cordoned off. For a few electric hours, the town clung to that shoe like it was a lifeline, the first solid piece of evidence that she had been there, that they were close. But the lab report came back with cold indifference. No blood, no clear prints, trace DNA so degraded it could have belonged to half the county. No way to prove it had ever touched Lily's foot. It was logged, bagged, and then placed into evidence with a label that might as well have read maybe. For the Hart family, it was a knife twist, hope raised and yanked away in a single week. Behind the scenes, the detectives ran parallel tracks, the visible search for a missing girl and the quieter dig through everything that might have touched her life. Her phone records were pulled apart call by call. Most contacts were exactly what you'd expect: family, friends, classmates, a pizza place, a rideshare at the airport from months before, But one number popped up several times in the 2 weeks before her disappearance, always short, always after midnight, no name attached. A prepaid phone, later found to be inactive, burned. Whoever had owned that number had called Lily 8 times. She'd called back 5. None of those conversations lasted longer than 3 minutes. No text, no voicemail, just a pattern, humming faintly under the surface. The detective circled the number on the board, drew a thick line through it, and wrote one word, unknown. It stayed there, a black hook in the middle of their investigation. The town filled in the blanks with its own imagination. Rumors spread faster than official statements. Some swore Lily had been secretly seeing an older man, someone married, someone important. Others whispered about drugs, about a party gone wrong in one of the rental houses up in the hills, a panicked cover-up. Anonymous tips flooded the sheriff's phone line. A white van seen near the cliffs. Strange lights in the forest. Screams heard from the direction of the old quarry. Every call had to be logged, followed up, chased down. Most led to dead ends. A few led to unrelated crimes, petty thefts, domestic disputes, a backyard marijuana grow. None led to Lily. The media morphed the story as the days turned into weeks. California teen vanishes on scenic road. Mystery along the cliffs. Small town terrorized by disappearance. Big outlets parachuted in, filmed dramatic stand-ups near the guardrail, then moved on to the next disaster when nothing new broke. But one phrase stuck. Cold case in the making. It was a warning wrapped as an observation, and in the corridors of the sheriff's office, it echoed louder than anyone wanted to admit. Sheriff Rick felt the shift like a physical weight. Initially, he'd been everywhere, on TV, in town halls, promising they'd find her, that no stone would be left unturned. As the weeks wore on and the evidence refused to cooperate, the questions sharpened. Why no arrest? Why no car? Why no body? Reporters asked if he'd brought in outside experts. Yes. The state, the FBI, profilers, analysts, cadaver dogs, drones when they could get them, everything that made a good soundbite. But underneath the polished answers was a more basic reality. Sometimes the trail just stops. The FBI's profile arrived in a thin manila folder. It suggested that if foul play were involved, and by then no one really believed otherwise, the offender was likely local, familiar with Ridgeview Road, comfortable working in the dark, possibly someone who had crossed paths with Lily casually before. It ruled out, tentatively, a transient predator just passing through. Offender may be embedded in community, possibly in position of trust. That line made everyone in Harbor Point look sideways at their neighbors. Detectives quietly revisited the list of people who had been near the beach that day. The off-duty lifeguard, the guy who sold bait at the pier, the bartender at the boardwalk bar who'd carded the group earlier, the photographer who was out taking sunset pictures and had several frames that, when zoomed in, showed Lily in the background, blurred but unmistakable. Each person swore they'd noticed nothing strange. Each person had an alibi that more or less held. More or less became the standard, and it wasn't enough. Summer dropped into fall. The tourist crowds thinned. The long, golden evenings shortened into early dark. The missing posters faded more, some replaced, some not. The Hart family turned their living room into a command center, boxes of documents stacked against the walls, notebooks filled with Diane's meticulous handwriting. Call logs, tip references, a timeline that sprawled over multiple pages. She wasn't willing to leave that job to the sheriff's office alone. If the official investigation stalled, hers would not. On the 1-month mark, the town held a candlelight vigil at the high school football field. Hundreds turned up. Teens huddled in hoodies, parents with tight jaws and tired eyes, teachers, shopkeepers, the mayor, the pastor. Candles flickered in the wind as they released white balloons into the night sky, each one carrying a small sticker with Lily's name and the words, "Come home." A local news crew filmed the whole thing, the anchor's voice soft and solemn, a community refusing to give up. But if you looked closely, you could see it there, underneath the hope, fear that this was the only kind of gathering they'd ever get. Months passed, other stories took over the headlines. A wildfire 2 counties away, a political scandal, a missing hiker in another part of the state. Lily's name moved from the front page to the inside columns and then to the occasional anniversary mention. But in Harbor Point, the absence didn't fade, it settled in. People started telling time in before Lily and after Lily. The case file thickened with reports but thinned in terms of real, live leads. Tips slowed. The anonymous number remained a ghost. The shoe in the ditch stayed a question mark. The blue Corolla might as well have evaporated into the air between the boardwalk and the cliffs. The words "ongoing investigation" appeared on fewer and fewer lips, replaced by a more chilling phrase whispered in the grocery store aisle, at the gas station, in the bleachers at Friday night games. Cold case. No one wanted to say it to Diane's face. In the sheriff's office conference room, though, the term was used in hushed conversations. Not officially, not yet. But detectives were being reassigned to newer files, fresher crimes, budget constraints, staffing shortages, the brutal arithmetic of law enforcement. You chase what you can still catch. Sheriff Rick fought for resources, argued, stalled, but even he could feel the momentum draining, like an engine running out of fuel. Then, almost a year after Lily vanished, something small and strange cut through the dull hum of routine. The Hart family mailbox, sitting at the end of their quiet street, received an envelope with no return address, no stamp, just their name, written in mechanical block letters, slipped in by hand. Inside was a single photo, printed on cheap glossy paper. An image of Ridgeview Road at night, taken from the passenger side of a car, the headlights illuminating the curve of the guardrail and the drop beyond. In the bottom corner, barely visible, a timestamp, 10:49 p.m., June 18th, 2005. The exact minute after Lily's last text. The photograph lay on the Hart family kitchen table like a threat. No letter, no message, just that washed-out image of Ridgeview Road at night, the guardrail catching the headlights, the darkness beyond swallowing everything else. Diane stared at the timestamp in the corner until the numbers blurred. 10:49 p.m., June 18th, 2005, 1 minute, maybe less, after her daughter had typed, "On my way home." Mark wanted to believe it was some cruel coincidence, a prank, a sick joke from some teenager who'd heard too much and knew too little. But even as the words formed in his mind, he was already reaching for his keys, the envelope trembling in his hand as they drove it straight to the sheriff's office. The air in the car felt thin, like the whole world was narrowing around that single second captured on cheap glossy paper. In the briefing room, under the hum of fluorescent lights, detectives passed the photo around in silence. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else reached for a magnifying glass. They scanned the guardrail, the tree line, the faint reflection of the dashboard. No license plate, no face, no clear marker of where exactly along Ridgeview the shot had been taken. Just a sense of motion, of being inside a car that was moving towards something. Sheriff Rick folded his arms, jaw clenched. "Whoever sent this," he said softly, "wants us to know they were there." He tapped the timestamp with a thick finger. "They want us to feel the clock." The forensics team went to work. The envelope was checked for prints, fibers, anything. The paper stock was compared to local photo labs, big box stores, the 1-hour kiosk by the mall. The timestamp format was matched against camera models, hunting for the brand, the firmware, some way to narrow down the field. It wasn't much, but after months of dead air, this felt like oxygen. Print analysis came back with the same answer the shoe had, nothing clean. Smudges, partial ridges, no match in any database. The paper was common, cheap, available anywhere from the grocery store to gas station kiosks. The photo itself had been printed recently, not from 2005. The chemicals and degradation said it was developed sometime in the last few months. That meant the original digital file either sat untouched for nearly a year before someone decided to print and deliver it, or someone had manipulated the image later, playing with dates like a god. Still, something in the grain of the picture caught an analyst's attention. At the far left edge, just above the blur of the guardrail, there was a faint, ghostly smear of pale color, white or silver, curving downwards. Enhanced, then enhanced again, it began to look less like a glitch and more like the suggestion of another vehicle's tail light, already heading away around the bend. 2 cars, same road, same minute. One of them documented, the other possibly vanishing. Was it Lily's? No one could say. The resolution refused to cooperate, and digital artifacts lied as easily as people. But the idea lodged in everyone's mind. Somebody had been behind her, or in front of her, or passing her. Someone had been out there on Ridgeview Road at the exact moment her phone went dark. Someone had kept that moment sealed away for nearly a year before dropping it into the Hart family mailbox without a single word. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a figure near the Hart house, a car idling late at night, a stranger lingering by the row of mailboxes. Most people shook their heads. One insomniac neighbor thought he'd heard footsteps around 2 a.m., maybe kids, but couldn't be sure. A camera at the corner gas station caught a blurred sedan rolling past around 1:57 a.m., too far from the Hart home to tie directly, too vague to track. In a town as small and ordinary as Harbor Point, every car looked familiar, until one of them wasn't. The photo became the case's new centerpiece. It joined the board in the briefing room, pinned beside Lily's smiling face, the timeline, the map of Ridgeview with its angry red circles. Detectives started calling it the Midnight Postcard. The FBI took another pass. Profilers weighed in again. This was a calculated move. Someone close enough to the case to know the symbolic power of that timestamp, someone who wanted control, to poke, to remind, to keep the wound open. Diane refused to let the envelope be another dead end. She began to understand something terrible. Whoever sent it wasn't just taunting the police, they were talking to her, to the mother who wouldn't stop calling the sheriff, wouldn't stop organizing searches, wouldn't stop taping fresh posters over weather-bleached ones. She was not just collateral damage, she was the audience. In the months that followed, the photograph sparked a new surge of attention. Local papers ran it as a grainy illustration under bold headlines. Cryptic photo deepens Lily Hart mystery. Unknown sender claims to have been on Ridgeview Road. Talk radio dissected it. Callers phoned in with theories, voices jittery and breathless. The internet, still crude compared to what it would become, lit up with early true crime forums and message boards, threads titled, "What Really Happened to Lily?" and "Who Sent the Ridgeview Photo?" An anonymous user claiming to be close to the case insisted the image proved law enforcement had missed something obvious. Another argued it was a hoax designed to distract. Someone else posted a shaky map of Harbor Point and Ridgeview, drawing thick lines and circles, convinced that a cluster of seemingly unrelated incidents in town, petty burglaries, a peeping Tom report, a vandalized car, were all connected to Lily's disappearance. Screens flickered late into the night in darkened bedrooms as strangers miles away clicked through grainy uploads, trying to solve a crime in a town they'd never visit. Back in Harbor Point, the attention brought a new kind of pressure. Every stranger who passed through, every car with an out-of-state plate, every quiet loner at the edge of a bar became a potential suspect in the eyes of residents now trained to be hyper-alert. The sheriff's office phone lines barked to life again. I saw a man taking photos near the cliffs. There's a guy in a silver sedan who keeps parking near the high school at night. I think my neighbor's acting strange. Each tip might hold something. Most held nothing, but they all had to be checked. Among the names that drifted to the surface more than once was that of a man named Carl Denton, mid-40s, longtime local, worked nights as a security guard at a storage facility on the edge of town. Quiet, lived alone in a trailer just off the highway. Owned, according to DMV records, a dark gray sedan and a small camper. He'd been pulled into the initial net of interviews in the early days of the investigation because he often drove Ridgeview Road to cut through to another county. At the time, his answers had been unremarkable. He'd been on shift the night Lily disappeared with timestamped logs and supervisor check-ins to back him up. Now, a year later, one of his co-workers called in anonymously to the tip line, breath-hot with guilt. "He's been off," the voice said. "More than usual, I mean. He gets jumpy when the news comes on. Keeps a police scanner in the break room. Talks about the Hart girl like he knew her, but I don't think he did." The co-worker mentioned something else. A camera. Old, but decent. Carl liked to drive and take night photos, he said. Roads, lights, the cliffs. Detectives paid Carl another visit. They found him in his small, cluttered trailer, the TV flickering with some late-night infomercial, the curtains half-drawn even though it was midday. His hands shook a little when he saw who was at the door. Nervous, he said, because cops made him nervous. Because he'd been questioned before and didn't like being under a microscope, he let them in anyway. They saw the camera on the table, an older digital model that matched one of the types capable of producing the timestamp font seen in the Ridgeview photo. They saw the shoebox full of printed road pictures, headlights stretching down asphalt, the glow of brake lights, the eerie calm of empty intersections at 3 a.m. They saw Ridgeview Road appear again and again, the same curve, the same guardrail, the same drop into darkness. When they asked about June 18, 2005, his story stayed consistent. On shift, logged in, cameras at the storage facility entrance recorded him stepping out to do rounds at specific intervals. No gaps long enough to drive to Ridgeview and back. He admitted he liked the cliffs, liked the feeling of driving at night when the town felt empty. "But I didn't see that girl," he insisted. "I didn't do anything to that girl." Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. His eyes darted to the camera on the table as if it might speak. They took the camera, pulled the memory card, ran the serial numbers. They found hundreds of images, some deleted but recoverable. Roads, gas stations, dirty snow by the side of a freeway 2 towns over, and yes, Ridgeview Road. But the metadata told its own story. All of his Ridgeview shots were taken months after Lily vanished. Night drives, he claimed, to clear his head. The detectives believed him mostly, or at least they couldn't prove otherwise. The camera was capable of the timestamp, but no direct match to the photo in the envelope surfaced. The thin thread that had seemed so promising frayed into nothing. Carl slipped back into the population of Harbor Point's uneasy shadows. Watched, not charged. Another name on a long list of almosts. Time did what time always does. It moved forward without asking permission. Seasons spun. Harbor Point kids who'd been in middle school when Lily disappeared, graduated high school, left town, came back for holidays, and saw her face still pinned up on the bulletin boards, now yellowed and curling. The Hart family plastered her smile on billboards along the highway with the word missing in bold red letters. They appeared on national talk shows, their voices steadier now, less raw but no less determined. "Somebody knows something," Diane would say into cameras. "We just need them to say it." Years passed. The case officially became what everyone had been whispering, a cold case, not closed, never closed, but shuffled into a drawer marked unsolved, pulled back out for anniversaries, for new detectives who arrived with fresh eyes and stubborn optimism, for occasional bursts of interest when a podcast or TV documentary decided to spotlight Harbor Point's ghost. Technology changed in the background. DNA testing grew more sensitive. Databases expanded. People sent their saliva to genealogy companies to learn if they were part Italian or 4% Scandinavian. Law enforcement quietly began using those same tools to crack unsolved crimes, building family trees that pointed to killers who thought they'd gotten away with everything. Headlines shouted, "Decades-old cold case solved through genetic genealogy." Every time one of those stories broke, the Hart family phones lit up with calls from friends and strangers alike. "Did you see? They solved another one. Maybe Lily's next." Hope became something digital, something that could sit in a database, waiting. In Harbor Point, the physical landscape changed too. New developments went up. Old shops closed and reopened under different names. Ridgeview Road was repaved, its guardrails replaced, its rusted bolts swapped out for new steel that didn't yet creak in the wind. A small memorial appeared at a turnout overlooking the cliffs. A simple plaque with Lily's name and the date she vanished, surrounded by flowers and, over time, weather-worn stuffed animals. Teenagers left notes there, some heartfelt, some half-joking because fear can sound like sarcasm when you're 17. True crime culture exploded. Streaming platforms, YouTube channels, podcasts, the words cold case, missing without a trace, unresolved mystery became titles, thumbnails again. Lily's story found a second life online, retold by narrators who weren't there, dissected by armchair detectives with message boards and red string diagrams of their own. Some theories were thoughtful, meticulously researched. Others were wild, accusing everyone from the sheriff to random townspeople whose only crime was bad vibes in a single frame of footage. One thing kept haunting those discussions, the photograph. The midnight postcard. People slowed it, enhanced it, ran it through filters, circled that faint smear of light at the edge like it was a confession. Some claimed to see a second car clearly, others saw nothing but noise. A few insisted the whole thing was staged, that the timestamp had been faked to torment the family. Whoever sent it, they agreed on one thing. That person had stayed silent ever since. No second envelope, no follow-up, just one flash of contact, then another 15 years of darkness. Then, almost exactly 19 years after Lily vanished, the quiet routine of Harbor Point was broken again, not by a new witness or a sudden confession, but by a machine chewing through old data. While detectives somewhere else in the state were working an entirely different case, a partial DNA profile recovered from an unrelated crime scene pinged faintly against a degraded trace found on a piece of evidence from Lily's file, the envelope that had once carried the Ridgeview photograph. The match was weak, incomplete, not enough to point to a single person, but enough to brush against a distant branch of a family tree, enough to suggest that somewhere out there, in California, there was a family line that touched both a crime committed last year and a missing girl who had disappeared from Harbor Point 2 decades earlier. And for the first time in years, the word resolved appeared in an internal memo about the Hart case, not as a claim, not yet, but as a possibility, a direction, a whisper of an ending that might finally be taking shape in the shadows. The cold case file didn't reopen with a slam of a door or a dramatic phone call in the middle of the night. It reopened on a Tuesday afternoon in an anonymous state office building with the quiet hum of servers and a soft electronic ping on a computer screen that belonged to a detective who had never even set foot in Harbor Point. Her name was Maya Ruiz, early 30s, State Department of Justice, part of a small, stubborn team assigned to cold cases that still had physical evidence to test and just enough political pressure behind them to justify the expense. She'd grown up 3 hours away in a different small town that could have easily traded places with Harbor Point in a news chyron. She knew the shape of stories like Lily's long before she knew the name. On that Tuesday, Maya was halfway through a lukewarm cup of coffee when a yellow notification box popped up in the corner of her screen. New possible kinship match. Partial. She clicked it out of habit more than hope. Most of these alerts led to nothing usable. Third cousins in other states. Overlaps that evaporated under closer scrutiny. But as the system loaded the details, the top line made her pause. Reference, Hart, Lily, missing person, 2005, Harbor Point, CA. The degraded trace from the envelope, the one that had carried the Ridgeview photograph, sat in the system under that reference. It had been uploaded years ago, little more than a faint, stubborn ghost in the data. For a long time it had matched no one. Now it brushed against another profile pulled from a newer case. A burglary turned assault in a different county, a suspect who'd tried to fight a patrol officer and left blood on the inside of a shattered squad car window. The suspect's DNA, clean, sharp, recent, didn't match the heart envelope directly. But the system suggested something else, a familial link. Not close, not parent-child or sibling, more distant. Somewhere along a branching line of relatives, there was shared genetic ground. It was like seeing two footprints in the sand, too far apart to belong to the same person, but similar enough to know they shared a gait. Maya leaned back in her chair, eyes skimming the data. The assault suspect's name, Adrian Pace, 39, lived in a town 2 hours inland, worked construction. No obvious ties to Harbor Point, no prior record for anything worse than minor traffic violations. But his family tree, the one genealogy specialist began sketching in the days that followed, told a different story. They dug through public records, ancestry databases, old obituaries. They followed marriage licenses, birth certificates, property deeds. A picture began to form, a scattered family with roots in multiple California towns, branches that forked out and looped back over decades. Cousins who barely knew each other, uncles who drifted, a grandfather who'd once owned a small mechanics shop in a coastal community that, on paper, looked unremarkable, until you saw the name, Harbor Point. That grandfather had 2 sons. One died young. The other moved in and out of the area for years, working odd jobs, never staying in one place long. His name appeared on voter rolls, DMV records, an old citation for trespassing near a restricted part of the cliffs. Not a major crime, just a note, a moment. But the address listed for him at the time made Maya's chest tighten. It was a rundown rental on the outskirts of Harbor Point, less than 3 miles from Ridgeview Road. The year, 2005. His name was Eric Pace, Adrian's uncle. Maya didn't rush into her supervisor's office shouting that she'd cracked the case. She'd been doing this long enough to know that cold cases were full of mirages. But the alignment was too sharp to ignore. A degraded trace on a taunting envelope from the Hart case, showing a distant kinship match to a man whose uncle had lived near the cliffs the year Lily vanished, a man with just enough of a paper trail in Harbor Point to prove he'd been there, and just little enough presence to mostly disappear afterward. She requested the Hart file, the whole thing, ship it up, scan it in, send the physical evidence that still remained sealed and labeled in long, dust-edged boxes. The envelope, the shoe, background items from Lily's room, early suspect swabs. When the files arrived, they took up most of a table in the records room. The cardboard smelled faintly of old paper and something else. Stale fear, maybe, trapped and waiting. For 2 weeks, Maya lived inside Lily's world. She read the original reports, the interviews, the typed transcripts of frantic calls. She studied the photograph from the envelope, the timestamp branded into her memory. She put faces to names, Jason, Carl, Diane, Sheriff Rick, through old photos and TV clips. She saw the entire case arc from bright early urgency to the slow, painful flattening that comes with time and silence. Then she turned to Pace. Eric had spent about 18 months in Harbor Point, in a weather-beaten duplex near the highway. Neighbors remembered him vaguely when re-interviewed by a local officer at Maya's request. A quiet guy, smoked on the front steps, drove an old light-colored sedan, sometimes parked near the bluff to watch the sunset. Not overly friendly, not overtly menacing. He was just there, one neighbor said, kind of like fog. You noticed him if you squinted. He'd worked a series of temporary jobs. Construction, odd repair work, a stint with a small landscaping company that serviced properties across the county, including houses not far from Ridgeview Road. He left town less than a year after Lily disappeared, moving inland. No one noticed exactly when he went. One day he was just gone. Maya pulled DMV records. Eric's driver's license photo stared back. Mid-30s, thinning hair, eyes that seemed simultaneously flat and wary, as if braced for the flash. His last known address was a small town 3 counties over, where he'd rented a room above an auto shop owned by a distant cousin. Then nothing, no employment records, no tax filings, just a final entry in a hospital database, deceased 2017. Cause of death, complications from untreated pneumonia. Next of kin, nephew, Adrian. The potential suspect with the most direct line to the Hart envelope was 7 years in the ground. For some detectives, that would have been the point where the case shifted from solve to summarize. A tidy narrative could be built. Unstable drifter uncle living near Ridgeview, possible access to Lily's route home, later linked through DNA on an envelope, now conveniently dead. Box checked. Case closed in a press conference with carefully chosen language about probable responsibility and no ongoing threat to the community. Maya didn't buy it, not yet. The unresolved envelope trace, the fact that the match was distant, the lack of direct evidence tying Eric to Lily beyond geography and timing, those gaps were too wide. She'd seen what happened when law enforcement got hungry for closure and fed that hunger with maybes. Families were handed paper answers that didn't stop their nightmares. Instead, she pushed for more: exhumation of Eric's body for a full DNA profile, a court order to access all of Adrian's family records, cooperative interviews with every surviving relative who might remember what he was like in 2005. It was a long shot, and it was expensive, but the Hart case by now had a name that carried weight in certain circles. The combination of media history, an unsolved disappearance, and the new genealogical angle was enough to pry open the right doors. Word traveled fast. It always did. Before any public statement was made, whispers started threading their way back to Harbor Point. Someone at the courthouse knew someone at the sheriff's office who knew someone married to a cousin of one of Lily's old classmates. They found something. It's DNA. It's family related. It's a guy who used to live here. The facts warped with each retelling, but the core message hit like a lightning bolt. After 19 years, someone was finally stirring the ashes. Diane heard first from Sheriff Rick, his voice older now, rougher around the edges. They'd both aged inside the same unsolved wound. He drove to her house instead of calling, sat at the kitchen table where the photograph once lay, told her about the partial match, about the man named Pace, about the state detective pushing the case back to life. When he finished, Diane sat very still. Her hands resting on the table trembled once, then went still too. "So you're telling me," she said quietly, "that the only real lead we have now is a dead man who might be related to whoever touched that envelope, which might be related to whoever took my daughter." Rick exhaled. "I'm telling you, it's movement. It's more than we've had in years." She looked past him, past the kitchen, to the hallway where Lily's bedroom door still stood half open. "Movement isn't the same as answers," she said, but she didn't tell him to stop. When officials finally confirmed publicly that new forensic developments had reinvigorated the Hart investigation, Harbor Point reacted like a body waking from a long, uneasy sleep. News vans reappeared, newer, sleeker versions of the ones that had crowded the town in 2005. Microphones found old faces, classmates now in their 30s, teachers retired but still haunted, Jason with new lines around his eyes, Carl raising his hands and backing away from cameras with a mumbled no comment that only made the more conspiracy-minded corners of the internet light up again. The headline this time was different, not missing girl, not cold case terrorizes town. It was crisper, bolder, almost triumphant. California 20-year-old disappearance reopened after DNA breakthrough. In smaller text below, a word that set expectations humming. Resolution possible. Maya came to Harbor Point under that banner, stepping into a town that had turned its worst memory into a kind of permanent background noise. She met with Rick, with the small remaining team at the sheriff's office, with the Harts themselves. In their living room, the walls were the same pale color they'd been in news footage from 2005, but the space felt heavier. The coffee table was covered with neatly stacked binders. A candle burned beneath a framed photo of Lily, now accompanied by other pictures, scanned yearbook pages, age progression sketches, an artist's rendering of what she might look like now at 38 if she were still alive. Maya didn't promise miracles. She laid out the facts in clean lines: the envelope, the partial DNA, the family tree, Eric Pace, the plan to exhume, the hope that his full profile would either snap the Ridgeview trace into focus or eliminate him entirely. Diane listened without interrupting, fingers tracing the edge of her mug. Mark sat beside her, jaw set, absorbing each detail like impact. "Will you tell us?" Diane asked. "No matter what you find, even if it's nothing, even if it's not what we want to hear?" "Yes," Maya said, "especially then." Outside, Harbor Point watched. At the grocery store, people lingered near the newspaper rack, eyes drawn to the familiar name in the headline. On Ridgeview Road, drivers slowed by the turnout with the small memorial, glancing at the flowers and weather-beaten stuffed animals, as if expecting them to move. On true crime forums, threads revived overnight, usernames old and new piling theories onto the fresh news. Some were wild, some chillingly plausible. All of them fueled by the same thing that had kept the Hart case alive for 2 decades, the deep human need to know what happened, to pull something hidden into the light. The exhumation order was granted. One gray morning, under a sky that couldn't decide between fog and rain, a small team gathered in a cemetery miles from Harbor Point. Cameras weren't allowed inside the fence, but that didn't stop a local station from filming the entrance, the hearse-like van, the anonymous white tent erected over a patch of disturbed earth. Inside, professionals in sterile gear moved with quiet focus. They raised what remained of Eric Pace from the ground, not as a man, but as evidence. Bone, tissue, fragments. All of it carefully packaged, labeled, transported to a lab where machines would do what human memory could not. strip away rumor and guesswork, and tell, in raw data, whether he was the one whose touch lingered on the heart envelope, whether he was the one who might have been on Ridgeview Road when a 19-year-old girl's life slipped off the map. For weeks, nothing visible happened. Out in the world, people went about their business, kids went to school, the ocean kept grinding against the cliffs. The memorial flowers wilted and were replaced. But inside labs and offices, inside Maya's brain, the case was moving. Old evidence was rescanned. The photograph was digitized at higher resolutions, run through new algorithms that hadn't existed in 2005. The unknown midnight postcard was fed to machines that hunted for geometric consistencies, reflections, overlooked details. One of those details emerged like a ghost from the noise, a suggestion of numbers, faint, distorted on a reflective surface in the lower right of the photo. Not the timestamp, everyone already knew that. Something else, something like the smeared echo of characters on metal, license plate digits, not the whole thing, not legible, just enough that when enhanced looked like it could be a 4 followed by a Q or an O, fatally ambiguous, enough to drive you crazy, not enough to clear or convict a soul. In the lab, the DNA process crawled forward. The exhumed remains surrendered a full, robust profile. Machines compared it to the degraded trace from the envelope again and again, statistically modeling degradation, contamination, the passage of time. When the report finally landed on Maya's desk, the conclusion was blunt. Subject, Pace. Eric is not the source of the unknown DNA recovered from item number E17, envelope, heart case. Relationship, consistent with avuncular kinship with Adrian Pace. Distant familial link to unknown contributor possible, but not direct. In other words, the uncle was not the one who had licked that envelope, held that photograph, pushed it through the heart mailbox slot in the dark. He was connected, just not in the way everyone had hoped would make this simple. The resolution people thought they wanted. It was him. He's dead. It's over. Evaporated like morning fog on the cliffs. What was left was more complicated, more frustrating, and, in a perverse way, more terrifying. Whoever touched that envelope, whoever stood in the darkness and decided to send that 1 minute after image to a grieving mother, was still unnamed, still out there, still entangled in a family tree now stretching its shadow over Harbor Point. The headline that pushed through that next news cycle was quieter, more cautious, less triumphant. New DNA tests deepened mystery in California cold case. Resolution had not arrived, it had only shifted shape. The lab report that should have tied a neat bow around the case instead sliced it open wider. Eric Pace was out, at least as the hand that touched the envelope. The DNA said it plainly, without emotion. Not him. Not the man buried under the white tent in the gray sky. The unknown trace belonged to someone else. Someone who brushed his family tree but wasn't him. Someone who let their genetic shadow slip into the heart file and then vanish back into the dark. Maya stared at the conclusion until the black text felt like static. In her head, she could already hear the chorus of disappointment lining up. The town, the press, the ones who wanted the dead man to carry the weight because the dead can't argue, can't deny, can't terrify a second time. But the numbers wouldn't bend into that story. Whoever had handled that envelope was alive when they touched it, and the odds said they were still alive now. She pushed back from her desk, the chair rolling a few inches on the scuffed linoleum. On the wall behind her, a printed, updated family tree spread wide like a web. Pace, in capital letters at the top, branches angling down to children, cousins, brothers, nephews. Eric's line was outlined in red. Adrian's was circled in blue. Several others were marked in faint pencil, scribbled notes beside them. Lived out of state. Deceased. No known kids. Unlocated. Her eyes landed on one name that had been underlined twice. Stephen K. Pace, mid-40s, cousin to Adrian's father. No death record, no recent property records. A scattering of low-level charges in counties up and down the state. Trespassing, public intoxication, a suspended license. A trail that flickered for a decade, then froze in 2006. His last known address, a rundown single-room rental above a bar in a town 30 miles from Harbor Point. Before that, 3 different addresses within a 50-mile radius of the cliffs. The dates overlapped with the summer of 2005. She dug deeper. Old employer records from a now shuttered auto body shop showed Stephen had worked night shifts the year Lily disappeared. An old landlord remembered him vaguely when contacted by phone. Quiet guy. Smoked a lot. Kept odd hours. Said he liked to drive when the roads were empty. Creeped my wife out a little, honestly. When asked if he ever mentioned Harbor Point or the ocean, the man paused. He had some framed photo of a road by the water, curvy thing with a guardrail. I remember because he hung it crooked and it drove me nuts. Ridgeview Road hung on a stranger's wall like a souvenir. The fragmented records didn't prove anything. Being related to the unknown DNA contributor didn't make Stephen guilty. Driving at night didn't make him a killer. But in cold case work, you learn to lean into gravity. Some names pulled harder than others, and this one felt like a weight dragging her hand down every time she tried to write something else. Before she went hunting for a ghost, she went to see the living link, Adrian. He was sitting in county custody on his unrelated assault case, a jumpsuit replacing whatever clothes he'd worn on the night he bled in the back of a squad car and accidentally fed his DNA into the system. In the cinderblock interview room, he looked tired, defensive, the kind of man whose anger had always been closer to the surface than was safe. He squinted at Maya's badge, then at the recorder, then at the thin file she set on the table. "You're not here about my case," he said. "Indirectly," she replied. "I'm here about an old one, your uncle's, and a girl named Lily Hart." There it was, the tiny flinch, not recognition of her, but recognition of the name. His shoulders tensed, then slumped. "I saw that on the news," he muttered. "My uncle's grave, DNA, all that. They're saying he might have been involved in some missing girl thing from back in the day. He lived in Harbor Point when she disappeared," Maya said. "He drove the same roads. He had extended family nearby. I'm not here to accuse a dead man. I'm here because our tests say someone related to you, distant but real, handled an envelope that was sent to her parents. I need to know who else in your family moved around that coastline back then." Adrian snorted, the sound more bitter than amused. "You know how many of us there are? My granddad had 5 kids. They all bounced around. Some stayed in one place, some lived out of their car. Holidays were a joke. Half the time, I didn't know who the hell I was saying hi to." He rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing. "But yeah, there was Stephen, my old man's cousin." "You knew him?" Maya asked. "Kind of. He'd show up, crash on somebody's couch, disappear again. He was one of those guys who liked to act like the world did him wrong. Always broke. Always with some story about almost making it doing something else. Music, photography, whatever." He shrugged. "My mom didn't like him hanging around. Said he drank too much. Said he stared at people when they thought they weren't looking." "Did he ever talk about Harbor Point?" Maya pressed. "Or the cliffs? Or a girl who went missing?" Adrian hesitated. The room seemed to shrink around them. He scratched at a crack in the tabletop with his thumbnail. "He had this one thing he'd say sometimes, when he'd had too much, about the coast, about driving out where there are no streetlights. He'd get that look like he was seeing it. He'd say, 'You ever been on a road where the world just drops away next to you? One bad move and you're gone.'" He swallowed. "I thought he was just being dramatic." "How long since anyone's seen him?" Maya asked. "Last I heard, before I got locked up, it had been years. He used to call my dad drunk once in a while, rant about people screwing him over. Then he stopped calling." Adrian's gaze sharpened. "Look, my Uncle Eric was screwed up, but he wasn't stupid. He wouldn't have gone after some girl. Stephen? I could see him doing something wrong and then hiding from it forever, but I don't know. I don't know what you want me to say." "I want you to tell me everything you remember about him," Maya said. "Where he worked, who he fought with, what kind of car he drove, if he ever had a camera." That made Adrian actually laugh, a short, sharp burst. "Oh yeah, he had a camera, thought he was some kind of artist, always talking about capturing the feeling of a road at night. I remember because he tried to take my picture one time when I was passed out on the couch, and I told him if he didn't knock it off, I'd break his face." He leaned back, eyes distant. "He had this thing about headlights on wet asphalt, said it was like painting with light. Headlights, asphalt, night, Ridgeview." By the time Maya walked out of the county jail, the afternoon sun had turned sharp and cold, the sky a flat slab of pale blue. She drove back toward the office with the radio off, the only sound the hum of tires on highway. In her mind, she saw the midnight postcard again, the guardrail, the curve, the faint smear of a second car's light. Someone with a camera, obsessed with night roads related to the Paceline, hovering around the coast in 2005. A man whose paper trail broke off in 2006 like someone walked into heavy fog and never came out. She dug hard. Driver's license renewals, traffic stops, old employer rosters, social services records. Somewhere in the years between 2005 and 2006, Stephen K. Pace left more than just his name on a lease. She found a mention in a police log from a town near the cliffs, a disturbance call at a bar, a minor fight, no charges filed. Officer notes described one of the men involved as white male, 30s, 40s, slurred speech, smelled of alcohol, stated he drives Ridgeview to clear his head. That phrase again, the road like a confession on repeat. There was also a hospital record, stitches on his scalp after a car accident on a rural road, late 2005. The attending physician noted he'd been found walking along the shoulder, dazed, the car nowhere in sight when responders arrived. When asked what happened, he'd mumbled about swerving for a deer, about the car not being his problem anymore, and refused to answer further questions. The location listed was a few miles inland, but the responding deputy wrote a side note. Subject may have left scene of accident, vehicle not recovered. Unclear if on private road or off embankment. It was smoke. A lot of smoke, no flame, no direct link to Lily, no irrefutable proof that the man who might have taken that midnight photograph was the same man who might have crossed paths with her on June 18, 2005. But the case was no longer oxygen-starved. It had air, it had heat. Word of the new family suspect leaked, as it always did. A blogger got hold of a partially redacted memo. A podcast repeated the name Stephen enough times that locals began to whisper it in the aisles of the supermarket. Did you hear? It wasn't the dead uncle. It's another one, another branch of the same rotten tree. They didn't know his last name. They didn't need to. In small towns, a first name and a hint are enough to build a myth. Harbor Point shifted again. The fear that had settled into a dull ache over 19 years flared fresh. Even people who had convinced themselves the case was unsolvable, unfixable, started checking their door locks twice. Because if the man who stood on Ridgeview with a camera and an envelope was still breathing somewhere, if he once walked the same streets, shopped in the same stores, drank in the same bars, then the story wasn't just about the past. It reached into their present, into their hallways and side streets, unseen. The revival of the case drew new eyes from far beyond Harbor Point. One of them belonged to a YouTube creator whose true crime channel had built a following with cinematic deep dives into unsolved mysteries, dramatic titles, slow pans over old photos, maps and timelines. The Lily Hart case was, to her audience, perfect. A beautiful girl, a vanished car, a coastal road, a cryptic photograph, now a fresh DNA twist connecting it to a family line with a missing piece. She drove out to Harbor Point with a small crew, cameras and drones in the trunk, the Ridgeview turnout programmed into her GPS. They filmed the cliffs at sunset, the waves exploding against the rocks below, the guardrail humming in the wind. They shot B-roll of the memorial plaque, the wilted flowers, the stuffed bear with one eye missing. They captured the town, Main Street, the boardwalk, the high school, the sheriff's office. They blurred faces when they had to. They also caught, in the background of one interview with a local, a man standing very still on the far side of the street, watching with an expression that, when the footage later hit the internet, made thousands of viewers hit pause and lean closer to their screens. He was middle-aged, in a faded work jacket, a baseball cap shadowing his face. Nothing remarkable at first glance. But in one frame, as a car passed and reflected a sliver of light up under the brim, there was a flash of something hard in the eyes. Familiar, some said. Too familiar, others insisted when they pulled up the old driver's license photo of the man the internet now believed must be Stephen. The problem was simple and brutal. No one could agree if it actually was him. Maya watched the uploaded video late one night in her office, the glow of the screen painting her face pale. She saw the pan across the boardwalk, the cut to the cliffs, the overlay of a narrator's voice telling Lily's story the way strangers always told it. Cleaner, sharper, rearranged into a neat arc missing all the real-life mess. And then she saw him, the man in the background, the half-hidden face, the micro-expression that looked for a heartbeat, like someone seeing a ghost and deciding whether to run or stay still and watch. She replayed that 3-second clip over and over, froze it, zoomed, enhanced as best she could from compressed video. The man's jawline wasn't quite right compared to Stephen's earliest photo. The nose looked a shade narrower. The age seemed plausible, but time can carve different paths into different faces. It could be him. It could be someone else who had the bad luck to be captured in a true crime channel's lens on the wrong day in the wrong town. The comments under the video exploded anyway. That's him. Check the guy at 1241. Look at how he stares. Why is no one talking about the man in the background? Amateur sleuths began isolating the image, comparing it to known paces, dragging in every male relative whose picture they could scrape from social media. The hunt took on a life of its own, messy, obsessive, dangerous. Maya knew what came next if she wasn't careful. Harassment of innocent people, wild accusations, vigilante justice built on pixels and gut feelings. She also knew that ignoring that background figure would be a dereliction. So she did what the internet couldn't. She picked up the phone. She called Harbor Point. She asked Sheriff Rick for every second of security footage from the blocks surrounding that interview shoot. Storefront cameras, traffic cams, anything that might have caught the same man from a different angle, in a different light. Hours of grainy footage poured in. She and a digital tech scrubbed through it frame by frame. They found him twice more. Once reflected for a second in the glass door of a hardware store as he walked past, head down. Once caught full-on by a parking lot camera, looking up at the lens as if he knew it was there. That second image was better, clearer. The hat from the YouTube clip was off. The face was fully visible, lines etched deep around the mouth, stubble ghosting the jaw. A scar along the side of the forehead that wasn't in the old driver's license photo, but could easily have been acquired during an accident on a dark rural road. The tech pulled up the DMV database. They ran facial recognition against archived photos of everyone named Pace, everyone with even a glancing tie to that family tree. The result came back not with flashing lights and triumphant music, but with a single number, a probability score, hovering in the kind of gray zone that makes careers and breaks them. Not certain, not random. A strong suggestion, nothing more. The computer thought the man in Harbor Point might be Stephen K. Pace. It also thought he might be a cousin, or a stranger with similar bone structure. In another era, that ambiguity might have stalled everything. But this was a case already thrumming with momentum and scrutiny. A missing girl, a DNA match, a family with too many secrets, a town with too much history, and now possibly a man who was supposed to have disappeared in 2006 standing in the background of a YouTube shot in 2024 like a glitch in reality. The story, already wild, twisted again. The question shifted from who touched the envelope to something sharper, more immediate, more dangerous. If that man really was Stephen, if he had come back to Harbor Point after almost 2 decades of silence, what had pulled him there? And more chillingly, what else had he brought with him? It didn't take long for the idea to spread. The man in the background, the one caught by a passing YouTube camera and a parking lot lens, wasn't just some random stranger. In Harbor Point, he quickly became something else, a specter people thought they recognized without ever saying his name out loud. At the diner, at the bait shop, in the half-lit aisles of the grocery store, people leaned in close and murmured, "He's back," as if the town itself were being haunted. Diane watched the video on her laptop at the kitchen table, alone. The narrator's voice washed over her, telling her own story back to her in a tone that was too smooth, too practiced. She muted it, scrubbed forward to the point everyone online had circled. There, her town, her street, the quick interview with a neighbor she knew, and behind him, slightly out of focus but unmistakably human, the man in the jacket and cap. A half-turn of the head, a flicker of light on his face, a glance toward the camera like he'd been caught peeking through a keyhole. She froze the frame, leaned in until her nose nearly touched the screen. She didn't know him. She wanted desperately not to know him. But something about him, the remote watchfulness, the way he seemed to be holding his breath, made her stomach tighten. She took a screenshot and printed it, the cheap ink bleeding slightly on the paper. The new image joined the old ones pinned to the wall by the hallway. Lily smiling, Lily at graduation, Lily's age-progressed sketch, the grainy Ridgeview photograph. Now this man's face hung among them, uninvited. At the sheriff's office, Rick stood with Maya and a small group of deputies watching the same footage on a larger screen. He recognized the street corner instantly, recognized the hardware store sign, the angle of the camera, recognized that look in the man's eyes too, the look of someone watching an investigation unfold from the sidelines, measuring how close the fire is getting. "We are not," he said, voice low, "going to let the internet do our job for us, but we're not going to ignore this either." The plan was simple in theory, messy in practice. Quietly build a bubble around Harbor Point with as many eyes as possible, both digital and human. They pulled recent traffic cam data from every direction in and out of town. They asked store owners for security footage from the past month, looking not just for that one face, but for a pattern. Someone who came in late, left early, hovered without buying. They cleared a small room and turned it into an ad hoc surveillance hub, screens glowing, roads crawling with recorded headlights. At the same time, they put boots on the ground. Plainclothes officers lingered near the memorial turnout on Ridgeview, sat in unmarked cars outside the diner and the bar, walked the boardwalk like bored tourists. They weren't hunting a headline, they were hunting a habit, because men like the one Maya was increasingly sure had something to do with that envelope, with that night, rarely came back just once. They tested themselves, they tested the scene, they orbited their own crimes like sick planets. Days passed. The YouTube video climbed views and then drifted out of the algorithm's spotlight, replaced by newer horrors and fresher mysteries. But in Harbor Point, the pressure didn't ease. Teenagers took turns daring one another to go up to the Ridgeview Memorial after dark, to stand by the guardrail and listen. Some swore they heard footsteps in the brush. Others claimed they saw a shadow moving beyond the tree line, just out of reach of their phone flashlights. Then, late on a Wednesday night, as fog rolled in from the bay and the cliffs vanished into a soft white void, an officer parked near the memorial saw a pair of headlights turn off the main road and creep toward the turnout with deliberate slowness. The car, a dull, nondescript sedan, pulled in and stopped behind his unmarked cruiser. For a moment, nothing happened. No one got out. The engine idled, a low, steady hum. The officer slid his hand toward his radio, thumb hovering over the button. "Unit 3, he said quietly. "I've got a vehicle at the Ridgeview pullout. 2 occupants, I think. No movement yet." His pulse thudded in his ears. He could feel the history behind him, the drop, the waves, the memorial plaque with Lily's name. The driver's door of the sedan opened. A man stepped out, middle-aged, jacket, baseball cap, exactly what you'd expect and nothing you could dismiss. He didn't look at the officer's car. He walked straight to the guardrail and leaned on it, staring out into the fog like it was a movie screen no one else could see. "Copy Unit 3, back up en route," came the calm voice over the radio. The officer stepped out, slow, hands visible. "Evening," he called. The man didn't jump. He turned his head slightly, acknowledging the voice but not the authority. "Nice night," he said. His voice was rough, like someone who smoked too much or talked too little. "Depends who you ask," the officer replied, moving closer. The fog beaded on his jacket, on the metal rail, on the small bronze plaque at their feet. "You from around here?" "Used to be," the man said. His eyes flicked to the plaque, landed on the name etched there, then slid away. "Just passing through." The officer's hand tightened around the small flashlight he wasn't yet using. "Mind if I see some ID?" The man smiled then, a thin, humorless stretch of lips. "You cops and your ID," he muttered. Always the same questions, different faces. He reached slowly into his pocket. No sudden moves, no drama. He pulled out a battered wallet and flipped it open. The license inside didn't say Pace, it said Miller, first name Sam, address, a town inland, consistent with the direction his car had come from. The photo showed the same man, younger by a few years, hair a little thicker, eyes the same. The officer took it, studied it, felt something prickling in the back of his head. People change names. They also don't. He kept his tone even. "You come up to Ridgeview often, Mr. Miller?" "First time in a long time," the man said. Behind him, the fog swirled, hiding the drop. "Used to drive it all the time when I was younger. Helps me think." "That so?" "Yeah." His gaze drifted back to the invisible horizon. Roads like this, they remind you how easy it is for things to go wrong. Those words, too close to what Adrian had said in that cinder-block room about his cousin Stephen's little speeches, slid through the officer's mind like a shard of ice. Backup headlights appeared on the road behind them, growing brighter as they approached. The man noticed. His shoulders stiffened. Some inner calculation flickered across his face. The second cruiser pulled in. 2 more officers stepped out, the weight of their presence tilting the scene. The man's eyes hardened. "Am I under arrest?" he asked. "Not at the moment," the first officer said. "We're just talking." "Then we're done," the man replied. He pushed off the rail, turned back toward his car. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to stay right there," the officer said, stepping into his path now. The calmness in his voice was gone, replaced by something sharper. "There's an ongoing investigation. You being here tonight fits a pattern we're looking at." The man's jaw flexed. His gaze flicked from one officer to another, then to the memorial plaque, then to the fog. Somewhere below, waves boomed against the rocks. "People drive roads," he said. "People stop at pretty views. That doesn't make them criminals." "It also doesn't make them invisible," a new voice cut in. Maya stepped out from the second car, the beam from a portable light slashing through the mist as if to underline her presence. She had driven in from the city the second the call about the unknown sedan hit her phone. She took the license, looked at the name, looked at the face, looked at something beyond both. "Sam Miller," she said. "You mind answering a few questions for me?" His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A tiny shift of weight, like someone bracing for a wave. Depends what they are. "Where were you in June of 2005? She asked. No warm-up, no slow approach. Specifically on the night of the 18th. He laughed once, a dry, brittle sound. "Lady, I don't remember what I had for lunch last Wednesday. You think I remember a night 19 years ago? You might," she said. "If something happened, if you used to go by another name, if you once lived less than half an hour from here and drove this road so often you could draw every curve from memory." His eyes snapped to hers. In the fog-filtered light, they looked almost colorless. "You got the wrong guy," he said softly. "I don't know your missing girl. I don't know you. I'm just a man taking a drive." "Funny thing about drives," Maya replied. "Sometimes they leave marks on guardrails, on cameras, on people." Behind them, one of the backup officers circled the sedan, noting the plates, the registration sticker, the tiny dash-mounted device that looked like an older model GPS but could easily store other kinds of data. He peered through the window and saw, on the passenger seat, a worn camera bag. "Detective," he called quietly, "you're going to want to see this." The man tensed. For a second, everyone moved at once, the officers closing in, his hand twitching toward the car, the beam of a flashlight bouncing wildly off fog and metal. In the scrabble of movement, his elbow caught the first officer's shoulder, the contact just hard enough to justify what came next. Hands grabbing his arms, twisting them behind his back, the metallic click of cuffs closing. "Sam Miller," Maya said, voice flat now, professional. "You're being detained pending further investigation, and for interfering with an officer, you have the right to remain." "You don't know what you're doing," he snapped, struggling once before going limp. "You think this is about some road, about some picture? You have no idea." She looked at him steadily. "Then help me understand. At the station, under clean, humming lights and an impassive camera, the man's story broke into small, hard pieces. He insisted the name on his license was his name. He denied ever hearing of the Pace family, denied Harbor Point, denied Lily, denied Ridgeview. He refused a DNA swab at first, then gave it only after a public defender arrived, and reluctantly advised cooperation to avoid making things worse. His fingerprints were taken. His car was impounded. The camera bag from his passenger seat was logged, tagged, opened. Inside, a digital camera, not new, not ancient, 2 memory cards, a small microfiber cloth stained with something that looked like engine grease. Maya watched as a tech slotted the first card into a reader, thumbnails popping up on a monitor like a strip of tiny, glimmering ghosts. Roads, at night, again and again. Headlights burning white in the dark, red tail lights smeared into streaks, empty intersections. Gas station signs glowing over blank asphalt. Occasional blurry shots of passing cars, angles weird enough to suggest they'd been taken one-handed through an open window while driving. There were dates embedded in the metadata. 2019, 2020, 2022, 2024. The obsession hadn't cooled with time, it had refined. She scrolled back, further, looking for older entries. The earliest image on the first card was from 2016. A different camera would have held the rest, the earlier years if they still existed at all. She switched to the second card. More roads, rain-slicked pavement, a bridge at dusk, finally a set of shots that made her throat tighten. Ridgeview Road at night, the guardrail, the curve, the drop into nothing. Taken from slightly different angles than the famous midnight postcard, but close enough that her body recognized them before her brain did. "Zoom here," she told the tech, pointing at one of the frames. In the lower corner of that photo, reflected in a piece of chrome, was the faint echo of numbers again. Not enough to form a full license plate, enough to confirm a habit. Whoever had taken the original Ridgeview photograph had stood in almost this exact spot, chasing the same angle, the same feeling. The road wasn't just a route to him, it was a canvas. The lab rushed his DNA through. Priority, emergency. The results landed in the system like a small explosion. The unknown trace from the heart envelope, the partial, degraded profile that had haunted the case for years, shifted its probability from distant match to highly likely source. 90-something%, not perfect, not courtroom bulletproof, but to anyone who'd lived with the cold emptiness of no match for 19 years, it might as well have been a scream. In the hallway outside the lab, Maya leaned against the wall, eyes closed for a moment. The man in the interrogation room, the man who called himself Sam Miller and claimed to barely remember where he'd been last week, had licked that envelope, had held that photograph, had stood close enough to the Hart mailbox to shadow the front door. That much was now more than a theory. It was written in the microscopic code of his own body. But there was still a jagged gap between an envelope and a disappearance, between a taunt and a homicide, between obsession and proof. When they put the report in front of him, his reaction wasn't shock. It was anger, cold and white-hot at the same time. He stared at the sheet, at the numbers, at the neat lines describing probabilities and matches, then slowly slid it back across the table. "You people love your science," he muttered. "You think it answers everything. You think numbers are the same as truth." "It answers this," Maya said. "You handled that envelope. You sent that photograph to Lily Hart's parents a year after she vanished. Why?" He shrugged, a small, infuriating roll of shoulders. "Maybe I found it. Maybe someone else dropped it and I picked it up. Maybe I like roads. Maybe I mailed a picture to someone because I thought they'd appreciate the art. That doesn't make me a killer." "It makes you a man who inserted himself into a family's grief," she snapped. "Into an ongoing investigation. It makes you someone who wanted to be close enough to their pain to feel it under your fingers." "That family wanted attention," he shot back suddenly, leaning forward. "They went on TV. They put up billboards. They made the whole world look at their tragedy. People like that, they make stories out of themselves. Can't be surprised if they attract storytellers." She watched his face as he spoke. There was something almost pleased in the way he said storytellers, as if what he'd done was an artistic collaboration instead of an act of psychological violence. "What happened on Ridgeview Road, June 18, 2005? She asked one more time. His jaw clenched. A pulse started to beat in his temple. For a second, she thought he might finally crack, might finally let the words spill out just to stop them from buzzing in his skull. But whatever truth sat behind his teeth stayed there. He smiled instead, a slow, unsettling expression that never reached his eyes. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "You should be asking what's still out there, what the road kept, what the water took and hasn't given back yet." Hours later, when she stepped out of the interview room, the sky outside had gone dark. Rain had started, tapping at the windows. The first drops of a storm weather report said would be rough. Heavy downpours, high winds, coastal advisories. Ridgeview Road would be slick, dangerous. The cliffs would be pounded by waves stronger than the ones that had been hitting them the night Lily disappeared. And somewhere between the guardrail and the ocean, in the soil and stone and water that had held its secrets tight for almost 20 years, that storm was about to pull at every weak point, every seam, every place where something buried didn't want to stay that way anymore. The storm hit that night like the ocean had finally decided to climb the cliffs and see what was on top. Wind screaming in from the bay, rain slamming sideways, power lines bowing under the weight of it. In Harbor Point, lights flickered, then died in some neighborhoods, leaving houses glowing by candle and phone screen. On Ridgeview Road, the advisory signs flashed warnings in the dark. High winds, slippery when wet, use extreme caution. Most people stayed home, pulled curtains, turned up the volume on the weather report, but the cliffs didn't care who was watching. The rain carved new paths down the face of the bluff, pouring like liquid knives into rock and soil that had held firm for years. Mud liquefied. Roots let go, sections of earth shifted, then slid. In the station, in a building that shook under the gusts, Maya stood by a window, watching trees bend and snap in the dark. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Updates from patrols, reports of small rockfalls, minor floods, a downed branch smashing through someone's truck windshield. Ridgeview had been officially closed an hour after the storm started. Barricades on both ends, no one in, no one out, on paper at least. In interrogation, Sam Miller, if that was his name, sat handcuffed, silent, the storm's howl muffled by cinder block walls. He didn't ask for a lawyer again. He didn't ask for food. He didn't ask for anything. He just watched the clock, eyes tracking the second hand in small, precise movements, waiting, it seemed, for something only he knew was coming. Around 2 a.m, a call broke through the storm noise on the radio. It came from a highway patrol unit posted near the Ridgeview closure, voice tight but level. Base, we've got a major slump near mile 10. Whole section of the bluff just came down. Debris all over the lane. Sending photos now. You're going to want to see this. Photos arrived as grainy, rain-streaked snapshots on a station monitor. A chunk of hillside ripped away, roots dangling like nerves, boulders scattered across asphalt. A twisted shape jutting from the newly exposed earth, slick with mud, half buried. At first glance, it looked like another rock. The second glance said metal. The third said something worse. Maya's pulse spiked. She grabbed her jacket, barked for a vehicle, and was out the door before the rain soaked the steps. By the time she reached the slump, the worst of the storm had passed, downgraded from violent rage to steady, miserable pounding. Floodlights from patrol cars cut white tunnels through the lingering mist. The air smelled like wet earth and oil. Mud sucked at her boots as she walked to the edge of the collapse, a deputy holding her arm as the ground shifted underfoot. There it was, not imagination, not rumor, not a phantom. A car, or what was left of one, wedged nose down in the torn-open slope. Years of mud and brush had cocooned it, turned it into a rusting fossil. Now the storm had ripped away the skin. A wheel poked free, tire rotted but still clinging to its rim. A slice of hood glinted weakly under the floodlight, paint faded to a color that might once have been blue. Her brain filled in the missing details before the facts caught up. "Get a stabilization crew," she said, voice tight. "I want that entire section secured before anyone goes near it. No one touches the interior until forensics is here. No one." Reports flew, calls were made. The word vehicle hit the Hart household like a physical blow. Diane and Mark didn't rush out into the storm. They'd learned the hard way that waiting, as cruel as it was better than arriving too soon and standing there useless at the tape. They sat in their living room, hands intertwined, faces turned toward the silence between news reports. In town, word spread anyway. Group chats, late-night texts, people leaning out of doors into the rain to tell their neighbors. They found a car on Ridgeview, a blue one. It took hours to secure the site. Heavy equipment arrived, operators working with surgical care instead of their usual brute force. They anchored cables, shored up the remaining bluff, scraped away soil in cautious layers. The car, inch by inch, emerged from the hill like something being dragged out of a grave. First the hood, then the roof, caved in on one side, then the rear end, where a faded badge still hung on by rusted bolts, Toyota. The color, once the mud was washed back, blue. When they finally cleared enough to see the outline of the driver's side door, the world narrowed to that rectangle of metal. The glass was gone, blown out or shattered long ago, leaving a jagged frame. Inside, the seat was collapsed, the dashboard warped. The steering wheel drooped like melted plastic, and beneath it all, tangled in seatbelt and debris, bone glowed pale under the mud. A hush fell over the crew that had nothing to do with rain. Even from the road, even under the harsh glare of floodlights, Maya could see it. The curve of a skull, the long lines of limbs folded at terrible angles. Clothes clung in tatters, colors leached, fabric stiff with time and earth. A thin bracelet still circled one bony wrist, too small to be anything but a teenager's. She swallowed hard, tasted metal and mud. "We do this by the book," she said to the forensic lead at her shoulder. "Every bone, every fiber, every scrap, documented, photographed, recovered, no mistakes." The team moved in with slow, reverent efficiency. They brushed away soil with gloved hands, with soft tools, with the care of people who knew they were touching someone's last chapter. Every few minutes, another piece of the picture came into focus. The way the dashboard had crushed inward, the angle of the steering wheel, the lack of airbag deployment that marked the car's older early 2000s, the odometer stuck at a mileage that would later be cross-checked against service records, the VIN barely legible under a film of rust and grime. It matched Lily's car. By dawn, the news wasn't official, but it might as well have been written across the sky. Harbor Point woke to a different kind of morning. The storm clouds were breaking, streaks of pale light stabbing through. In kitchens and bedrooms and cars idling in driveways, people heard the whispers. They found her car, on the cliff, with her. No one said body out loud if they could help it. They said remains. They said Lily. They said finally. At the station, Maya stood in front of a whiteboard that had just acquired a new heading, Ridgeview Discovery. Under it, photos, printouts from the slump site, shots of the car from multiple angles, the bracelet on the wrist, a partially preserved sneaker still on one skeletal foot. Next to them, an old missing poster with Lily's picture looked suddenly younger, more fragile, like the paper itself had aged and she had not. Across the table, a forensic pathologist went through the preliminary findings. Age approximation matching late teens, sex, female, height estimations within Lily's range, no obvious signs of gunshot or stabbing, not with the damage the vehicle and time had done. Fractures consistent with high-speed impact and subsequent compression. Could it have been an accident? A deputy asked, the question scraping through the room like a chair on tile. It could, the pathologist said slowly. The position of the car, the damage, the slope. It could be consistent with the vehicle leaving the roadway at speed, rolling, or sliding down the embankment coming to rest here. But, Maya echoed. The angle of travel is strange, he went on. From what we can see, it looks like the car didn't simply drift off. There are scrape marks higher up on rock that suggest a more forceful deviation. Hard to say until we map all of it. And then there's this. He slid a clear evidence bag across the table. Inside, a fragment of plastic, curved, dirty, a piece of a headlight housing, different make, different model than the Toyota. We found this embedded in the soil near where the tire tracks would have started, he said, closer to the roadway. It doesn't match your victim's vehicle. It matches something that hit her or something she hit before she went over. Collision, impact, another car. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the line between accident and intention narrowing to a knife edge. In the Hart living room, when officials finally arrived, there were no TV cameras, no microphones. Diane and Mark sat where they had sat for 19 years, only older now, their grief layered, sedimentary. They listened in silence as Maya and Sheriff Rick told them what the storm had revealed. "We can't say with 100% certainty yet," Maya said carefully. "We'll confirm with dental records and DNA, but given the location, the vehicle, the personal items recovered, we believe these are Lily's remains." Diane didn't cry the way she had once, loud and raw. Her eyes filled, then overflowed quietly. She reached for Mark's hand, fingers locking around his. "She was there," she whispered. "All this time, right there." Mark stared at a fixed point on the wall, jaw working. "Was she alone?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Was anyone with her?" "We found no other remains in the vehicle," Maya said, "and no immediate evidence of another person inside, but we did find indications of a collision before the car left the road. We're still analyzing what that means." Diane's gaze sharpened. "You have someone in custody," she said. "The man at the cliffs, the one from the video. Did he do this to her?" "I can tell you this," Maya replied. "His DNA is on the envelope that brought you that photograph. That cannot be an accident. He has a connection to Ridgeview Road and to your case. But whether he caused the crash, whether he was there that night, that's what we're still trying to prove." "The headline says resolved," Diane murmured bitterly. "They'll run that, won't they? Remains found, case closed, town gets closure. But I don't feel resolved. I feel like someone ripped the bandage off and shoved the wound into the air." Maya didn't argue. Outside, a news van was already turning onto their street, satellite dish rising like a periscope. The story was moving faster than the facts again. Back at the station, Sam, or Stephen, or whoever he truly was, sat in his cell as if he could feel the shift in the world outside. When they brought him the news, his eyes flickered once. "They found her," Maya said through the bars. "Her car, her remains, on the cliff below Ridgeview. The road finally gave her back." He leaned against the wall, cuffs clinking. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked older than his license said, tired. "Then you don't need me anymore," he said quietly. "You have your answer." "No," she replied. "We have her. That's not the same thing. You have a crashed car on a bad road in the rain," he pointed out. Happens. Has always happened. Will keep happening. Sometimes the world tilts and someone goes over. Maybe that's all this ever was. She stepped closer. If that's all it was, why the envelope? Why the photograph? Why stand in the dark and put that image in her mother's hands a year later? What kind of accident needs a performance? He smiled that same thin, infuriating smile. Maybe I'm just one of your ghosts, he said. Maybe I saw a broken guardrail once, took a picture, and thought it meant something. You people are the ones who made it a story. Maybe I just added a chapter. He was lying. She could feel it and not prove it. His DNA on the envelope, his camera on the passenger seat, his nights spent orbiting Ridgeview like a moth around a porch light, everything pointed to him. But pointing and pinning were not the same. Forensic teams returned to the slump site in daylight, mapping every scar in the dirt. They found, higher up the slope, a faint groove where a tire had dug in hard, as if pushed sideways. They found embedded paint fragments that, under lab analysis, matched a make and model not too far from the old DMV listing for a car once registered to a younger Stephen K. Pace. They found enough to reconstruct a plausible scenario. Another vehicle impacting Lily's from the side or rear, at the wrong angle, at the wrong second, turning a curve into a launch point. What they didn't find was the second car. No wreckage, no buried chassis, no twisted frame. If it had gone over too, it had been removed years ago. Or it had stayed on the road and kept going, leaving Lily's Corolla to tumble alone into the dark. The broken headlight fragment and the paint chips were the only ghosts of it. In the lab, side by side, they placed that fragment and the plastic piece recovered years earlier from the drainage ditch, the one that they'd never firmly tied to Lily's case. The curvature matched. The material composition matched. Together, they told a simple, ugly truth. The same vehicle that had left that shard in the ditch had left its print on the cliff. They pulled every old citation, every tow record, every insurance claim related to vehicles owned by any member of the Pace family tree in the years surrounding 2005. They found one minor report, a single-car accident on a rural road, no other vehicles listed, driver stating he'd swerved for an animal and hit a rock. The make and model of the car on that claim lined up too neatly with the fragments now in evidence. The driver's name on that old report, Stephen K. Pace. Paper ghosts, plastic ghosts, data ghosts, all of them circling the same man in the same pattern, tightening in. Enough for suspicion, enough for headlines, enough maybe for an arrest, for charges written in careful ink, vehicular manslaughter, leaving the scene, tampering with evidence, obstruction, enough to put him in a courtroom and force him to sit in the same room as the family whose life had been torn open along a guardrail he loved too much. But when Maya looked at the board in the briefing room, at the photos and lines and fragments, she saw the void too. No eyewitness, no confession, no full video, just a storm-torn hillside finally revealing what it had swallowed, a man with a camera addiction and a talent for being exactly close enough to smell tragedy without ever letting it splash directly onto him. Harbor Point's story shifted again. California 20-year-old disappearance resolved, the headlines proclaimed when the remains were officially confirmed as Lily's. Storm uncovers car, answers decades-old question. Newscasters talked about closure, about finally knowing, about a family's long nightmare ending. But in the quiet corners, in the Hart living room, in the sheriff's office, in Maya's sleepless thoughts, another headline kept pulsing underneath the one on the screen, a private ticker only they could see. Car found, body found, road explained. The man in the background? Not resolved, not yet.